This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate.
Any interest, financial or otherwise, just as we move through today's business, and just to ensure all your devices are switched off, including your tablet, which is function F8. I'm not sure I would say that much longer. You think members should know?
I've never figured out how to make a noise.
Pardon?
I've never figured out how to make a thing make a noise.
Okay.
Safe enough.
So our first briefing is on our inquiry, our sharing education inquiry. We have CCMS and the Catholic Commission. Just refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 115 and to the submissions to the inquiry from both CCMS and the Commission. Welcome Jim Clark, the Chief Executive at CCMS, Molly Cucudden, Head of Education Standards at CCMS, and Father Tim Bartlett from the Catholic Commission. Gentlemen, you're all very welcome.
Thank you
for coming to meet with us this morning. And can I invite you to make an opening statement, and members will follow up with some questions.
Chair, can I thank you very much indeed for your welcome, and may I also begin by thanking the committee this morning for its generosity in facilitating the earlier start to our discussion today. As you know, we have to leave as close as possible to 11 a.m. To attend the funeral of the late Sheila Lundy, the mother of our colleague Mr Jerry Lundy of CCMS, who would otherwise have been with us this morning in some capacity. As you have mentioned, Chair, so thank you very much, Committee and Chair, for that, and to indeed the staff of the Committee for helping to facilitate that. As you mentioned, my name is Father Tim Bartlett, and I'm here on behalf of the Northern Ireland Commission for Catholic Education. As a member of that commission, and NICE, as we abbreviate it, represents the Catholic bishops and the leaders of religious congregations in their role as the trustees of the family of over 500 Catholic maintained and Catholic grammar schools in Northern Ireland. In other words, we are the trustees of the largest single sector of education in Northern Ireland. And on behalf of NICE, I welcome the opportunity to engage directly with the Education Committee this morning in respect of our written submission on the theme of shared and integrated education, which I understand you have received copies of. And perhaps, Chair, I could suggest that the most important point I would like to highlight from that written submission is the point made in paragraph 3 of the submission. And that is, in essence, that commitment to promoting respect, tolerance, understanding, and indeed, I don't shy away from using the term as a Christian, promoting love of every person in society is precisely what defines the very purpose and aim of a Catholic school, and for the Catholic Church, the whole mission of the Church in education. And this is because Catholic schools are based upon the gospel of Jesus Christ, which, as you all know, has at its very heart the message of love of God, of neighbour and of self. And in this includes a profound duty to love and care, especially for those who are most vulnerable, the marginalised, and those most in need in any society. And a lot of the religious congregations in particular on this island that have involved themselves in education grew out of that particular interest or concern for the most marginalised and those most in need. Catholic education also, therefore, implicitly includes a commitment to forming citizens who contribute positively and constructively to the common good of society. Commitment to the common good is a fundamental tenet of Catholic social teaching and doctrine. And essential to that, again, is a commitment to building peace, mutual understanding, and reconciliation. And if I may be so bold as to suggest this morning, it is sometimes forgotten in political commentary and indeed in general debate in Northern Ireland that these are fundamentally Christian concepts, concepts that have been promoted, supported and articulated by Catholic and other Christian church leaders over the years, not least at times when they were not as popular and as claimed by politicians or secular commentators and groups as they are today. So I just want to put that on the table, that these themes that are at the heart of the whole concept of sharing and integration, and ultimately the task of peacemaking, the common good, mutual understanding and reconciliation, these are all at the very essence of the Christian message and Christian churches and their mission. I'm not claiming that we've always lived up to those, but they are what drive and sustain us fundamentally. And in the case of the Catholic Church, that is fundamental to the mission and purpose also of Catholic schools. So commitment to these values is fundamental to our schools, and our Catholic schools continue to be in high demand, both here in the north of Ireland and throughout the world, by parents from a very wide range of backgrounds. Indeed, Catholic schools on this island and elsewhere have a very proud record of openness and inclusion, and in particular to newcomers to our shores here. I'm also mindful, for example, at the international level of the time I visited Gaza in 2008, and there the largest school in Gaza City, primary and secondary school, is the Holy Family Catholic School, and it is 96% Muslim. And the day that I was there was their graduation ceremony, which went on for hours, and the Muslim children put on a great show on the theme of the prodigal son, as a play that was written, developed from that gospel story by the then parish priest, Monsignor Musalam, who, although he lived only and grew up only 40 miles away from Gaza, had never been able to get out of Gaza for 20-odd years to see his mother 40 miles away. So that was his commitment to peace and reconciliation. And I just cite that as one of many international examples of the consistency of a Catholic view and mission of education with the values of inclusion, reconciliation and peace building. This commitment of Catholic schools to peace, reconciliation and the common good was set out by the Catholic bishops in their nodal document called Shaping Peace, Building the Future, which I would commend to the attention of members of the committee and of which we have copies here for you. We'll leave those with you. And in that document we point out not only the commitment of the Church to the value of sharing and reconciliation in our society and the role of our schools in that, we point out that any such effort on the part of schools involves a wide range of strategies, partnerships, shared activities, curricular initiatives and so on. And that we are committed and have always been very committed to engaging with any of those initiatives as part of the fundamental mission of our schools and our commitment to peace and reconciliation. More recently, we have engaged with the Transferors Representative Council and the Department of Education about looking at a whole new concept of joint church schools in Northern Ireland. These already exist in GB, and we have always been enthusiastic about the concept of looking at joint church schools. But what isn't always appreciated is the particular development of the systems here in Northern Ireland, where in fact the Protestant churches, as you know, handed over their schools to the state, and therefore it was difficult to engage in a model of trusteeship of a new type of joint church school in a similar way that we have done in Britain with Anglican and other Christian denominations to set up joint faith-based schools. But happily, we've had a very constructive conversation with the department and the Transferors about that, and I think the Transferors mentioned that to you at their last meeting. So we mention in our report, and I'll draw to a conclusion with this, that Sir George Bain, in his report in 2006, and this is in paragraph 8 of our submission, he pointed out what I'm actually saying we are committed to, that all schools and indeed all educational interests need to and wish to play their part in the journey towards the goal of a shared future. And then he concluded, we advocate, therefore, not a single approach to integration, but a more pervasive and inclusive strategy. A more pervasive and inclusive strategy. Focused on the dynamic process of integrating education across the whole system. And as I say there, NICE supports the general principle underlining that approach. That is a good summary of our disposition and our commitment. Then I would just, in conclusion, like to say that at the heart of this debate, we would suggest in our submission, and it might be something we want to pick up on our conversation this morning, that this is also part of a wider conversation about what do we mean by a diverse and pluralist society. Do we see integration in the narrow sense as some form of homogenisation of diversity, which is essential to a pluralist democracy. We would wish to claim, citing not least the European Convention and other international instruments of human rights, that parents have the right to have their children brought up in accordance with their religious and philosophical convictions. The two established parameters on that, or conditions on that, are one, also a duty on all parents and providers to the common good. I am making the argument that the trustees of Catholic schools are fully committed to the common good of this society through their schools, and we have consistently demonstrated that. The second caveat or parameter is available resources. In that regard, that is something that, again, the Catholic trustees and CCMS have demonstrated they are incredibly responsible administrators of, in terms of efficiencies within the Catholic education system, and we are at the forefront of area planning at the moment in terms of finding greater efficiencies across the systems, as well as opportunities for sharing in new and creative ways. But I want to emphasise the point. Our challenge to the general thrust of how this debate tends to go in the public domain is, in any normal, democratic, pluralist, diverse society, it is totally appropriate and consistent with human rights principles that there would be diverse provision in accordance with parental rights, including provision of faith-based schools where they are chosen in significant numbers. Those schools are also, in terms of the Catholic ethos of education, completely consistent with the common good. And there's a few other points I'll maybe make as the conversation develops. But, Chair, I thank you for the invitation to be here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just pick up, if you like, from the base of the philosophical backdrop that Tim has created, and recognise CCMS as an NDPB which has to deliver on the ground. So I'm going to take a more operational perspective on this. And the first thing that I want to say is that when we made our submission to the committee late last year, the media picked it up as a kind of an attack on the integrated sector. And I want to state absolutely clearly that we have the utmost respect for the integrated sector, its right to exist, and indeed its philosophy of education, and indeed its philosophy of life. However, we recognise that over the 30-odd years, it has not achieved what perhaps people in the mid-1990s would have expected in terms of outcomes and support. And our comments were a response to the reality, not to the right. And of course, media sometimes does want to sensationalise things, and I can understand that. But I think it's very important that that position is stated. That does not diminish our belief that there are things which need to be changed, and our commitment to shared education is a recognition that there are different routes to the same objective, and that objective is a much more peaceful, settled, inclusive society where there is respect and recognition of the rights of others. And education has a role to play on that, but it is not the only player in the game. There are issues that are practical. One of them is that anywhere in the world, education, particularly in the early years, is local. It is a community-based activity. If our communities are of one denomination or one class or one ethnic group, then there's a likelihood that that's going to be replicated in the schools. How we break that down is a job for schools. It is a responsibility of education, but it's not education's responsibility alone. And we have to look at the society we have and how that society is shaped and framed, where it lives and how it lives, to understand part of what our education system looks like at this particular moment in time. And if we accept the principle, which we do, of parental choice, then we have to accept that parents make choices for a whole range of reasons. And certainly, in those early years, convenience is one of them. And if an area is predominantly one grouping or another, there is a likelihood that parents will make that choice. So we are faced with what people have chosen. They also choose because they make decisions about the kind of education that they want. And on that basis, the right to a faith-based education is a right which exists throughout the world, and one which we in Northern Ireland I feel ought to respect. And I don't think that there is any dispute about that. However, there are times when it appears that, and maybe this is a view which is an external view as well as an internal view for some, that the only way to move forward is to get rid of those groups which appear to be the purveyors of the past, the big sectors of the Catholic and controlled sectors. That's illogical, it's impractical, it's not deliverable. And it's on that basis that we look at this issue. What is deliverable? The shared schools agenda, in our view, is a spectrum, from very limited association from one school to another to what Tim has described in terms of jointly managed faith-based schools and indeed integrated schools at the apex of that. But the reality is that is not going to be achieved overnight, and indeed the evidence is over the last 30-odd years that it has only been achieved to a very narrow degree, and the extent to which the decisions of parents in relation to sending their children to an integrated school is about integration is open to question, because there are a whole range of other things which may impact on their decision making. Education undoubtedly has a role in delivering a shared future for everyone, but so too does society as a whole, and we've got to see it in that broader picture. There are issues about school size, and it's often said that in a diverse society we want to create new schools or bring schools together which balance the community. Again, I make the point that that is achievable where people buy into it. It cannot be imposed. It is a bottom-up model. People, by people I mean parents, have to make the decisions. It cannot be something which can be legislated for. And on that basis, we have a range of policies around area planning. We have the Sustainable Schools Policy. And we have to look at this issue within the context of those policies. In some ways, sustainable schools might create circumstances which allow for a greater degree of sharing, a jointly managed school being an optimum on that particular strand. However, we cannot force that. And the Deloitte report back around, I think it was 2007, thereabouts, it identified the issue of the costs to a divergent society in Northern Ireland. In real terms, and one of the acknowledged this in a radio interview that I was part of, that economies of scale, it doesn't matter from what background people come, it's the economy of scale to achieve the curricular output that young people are entitled to. So we have to have sustainable schools that deliver an educational service, not schools that are there as preservations of one community or another. If they live within the constraints of funding and the policy, then there's every reason for those schools to be retained. If they don't, then we have to look at alternative models. And certainly, the integrated model is one, a joint faith-based model is another, but a sharing model with a wider range of choice within the curriculum is another. I think if we're going to look at shared schools, we have to ask, what is the purpose of this? And we see it very much as increased access to the curriculum and to curricular choice for young people, in post-primary in particular. We are going through very difficult financial times, as everyone in this committee will well know. And one of the things which has suffered over the last number of years is the degree to which teachers and others have had access to professional development. The context for schools working together on that basis, I think, is very strong and is being promoted further now by the expansion of the principle of area learning communities from the post-primary into the primary and nursery sectors. The economy of scale is very important, but we always have to have in mind that all of us have a role towards the common good and to creating a peaceful society. It is our view that legislation is not the way to do this, and by that I mean not just reference to Article 64 of the 89 Order, which gives the requirement to the integrated sector to be facilitated and encouraged, but also to any legislation around sharing. I mean, as the Ducote report back in 1998 indicated, schools will move forward according to the circumstances in which they find themselves, and not every environment is exactly the same. So therefore, I think it would be difficult to impose targets, and the problem with targets is you could be pushing towards them for the wrong reasons, and you could be also creating a circumstance where you're not going to be able to deliver, because, as I've said, parental choice is a key player in this game. And of course, in the area of funding, I think what we would encourage, and indeed CCMS is going to set out now tomorrow on the first of a series of meetings with principals, to encourage interdependence, working with schools in the community, in the wider community, rather than simply seeing the delivery of an education as being something which is only in that school alone, and indeed the wider issues of the school within the community, I think, need to be taken into account as well. So ALCs are practical responses. We see sharing as a practical response to an educational need, to a societal need. But we believe that it is one of those things which does not necessarily lend itself to a programme for government target or indeed a Department of Education target. One of the big issues, of course, when we look at sharing is that there's a tendency to see this in terms of religious difference. We have racial difference in Northern Ireland, and we have a significant class difference. And if we go back to the report on sharing and integrated education, the issue of selection is a key one. And the right for people to access schools with an equality is a key issue here. And I think when we look at sharing, we have to look at sharing right across the spectrum. And again, I go back to the point, it has to have a practical outcome. And we are there to create the conditions and the circumstances where sharing becomes the natural response to dealing with how things move forward in our society and in our education system. And in that respect, I think I will use the analogy that I think sharing for me is maybe a little bit of my own background, growing up in a street which was a mixed street, Catholics and Protestants living together side by side, knowing each other, working with each other, being friendly with each other. And that's the kind of view that I would see sharing having. I think sometimes the purity of the integrated model requires almost for everyone to be living in the same house, not to be living on the same street. I think the reality is it's more achievable to live in the same street than to live in the same house.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, can I...
Right, perhaps I can just conclude by making a few brief points and to say that the commitment of CCMS to shared education is very evident in the fact that we are involved in a number of shared education initiatives right across the country. And I would point out that some of those initiatives actually predate the shared campus discussions and also the shared education initiative coming to the fore in recent years. And as Jim has said, our approach is very firmly based on the educational principles and how can shared education contribute to providing greater access and greater equality of access to as broad a curriculum as possible, particularly within the post-primary sector. CCMS has demonstrated its commitment to these shared education initiatives and is especially supportive of them when they come from the bottom up. CCMS is not necessarily proactive in this respect. To date, we have been mostly reactive in supporting initiatives for shared campuses and shared education when that has come from the communities themselves, because in order for these to be successful, they must have full community support and full community buy-in. And in the past, where shared education has been successful, and in the future where it will be successful, it must be based on respecting difference. We have to accept that we live in a society where we are not all the same. Our aim is to create a mature and inclusive society. That's a goal that we all share. And in that society, we must be able to respect and cherish difference. While waiting outside, finally, just to come in here this morning, I noticed there's a plaque on the wall to the late Senator Paddy Wilson. And at the bottom of that plaque, there are 3 words: equality, tolerance and respect. And I would like to say this morning that CCMS is fully committed to those principles, and it is our belief that we can fulfil those principles through a diverse provision within our education system.
Thank you very much. Apologies.
Okay.
First of all, can I just pass on my sympathies to Jerry Lundy on the passing of his mother?
Thank you.
And I'm sure I speak for other members of the committee in relation to that. You've outlined very well, in fact, a Catholic education and what you see in your schools, and particularly around peace and reconciliation, and this feeling for common good. I visited many schools, and I don't see an alternative to that. I see that in controlled schools. I see that in integrated schools. Mm-hmm. Could you define the difference between Christian education and a Catholic education, or is it about control?
That's a very good question, isn't it? No, I think there are two dimensions to it. I think a Christian school based on the objective document of the Christian gospel and the message of Jesus Christ, that's the claim that any Christian ultimately makes, that's their point of reference. I think what we are saying is two things, that the values that are articulated there in terms of the principle of love of neighbour, of God, even of enemy, in that very harsh sense of describing an enemy, is fundamental to what animates the values of that community gathered in that place and the mission behind that educational enterprise. And so we're saying it's a religious vision, but it's also one that is completely consistent with human society and the common good, the principle of the common good. In other words, it affirms what is good for society. The charge has often been that any religious claim, and this is why I did say that this is part of a wider debate about religion and society, the whole concept of what do we mean by a pluralist and diverse society. So it takes us into this whole spectrum of issues. But in relation to education particularly, I would say that what sets apart a Catholic school in this context as opposed to, say, a control school, or I would even argue, as I understand it, some integrated schools as they exist, is this, is that the defining purpose of that school and the legal protection in terms of the ownership by the trustees of the enterprise and the actual property in that sense guarantees that that is the core driving purpose and objective. Now, in an increasingly secular society, controlled schools cannot guarantee that. They cannot guarantee that because there's no legislative protection, or there's no protection in terms of the trusteeship of those schools. Okay? I agree with you that it's there. It's largely there. But that's what I see as the difference. So it becomes more stark if, for example, you take Catholic education at an international level. There are many societies where, whether they're atheistic or otherwise, that protection, that difference, that mission becomes more distinctive relative to the society. But I think it's part of the good news that we can build on, that, as you properly say, in fact, all of our schools are largely committed to that vision. What makes it different, and why the Catholic Church did not hand over its schools to the state, is because it guarantees that. And it's also then, as I understand it, and I stand to be corrected here, that some of the integrated schools, it will depend on your Board of Governors what the specific commitment is to a Christian ethos specifically, okay? To human values of peace and reconciliation, absolutely. That's what defines them. We welcome that, we support that, we can happy to engage with that and cooperate with that. But the final thing I would say is we also have a right to a specifically religious character and identity, and to have that reflected in the building, in the delivery of the whole curriculum, and in the liturgical and pastoral life of that community, because parents who are taxpayers, and even those who are not, have the same right as others who are not, in a publicly funded system, to choose a system that reflects their religious ethos. So the first thing is, it's a response to parents to have a distinctive character to a Catholic school that is Catholic in that sense, in a religious sense. Two, that fundamental shared common good, reconciliation, peace values that are central to Christianity are protected in law by the fact we own and manage and are trustees of our school. And thirdly, other school sectors in Northern Ireland don't have that same level of protection, even though I openly acknowledge that the vast majority of them are fully committed to those same principles, and I welcome that. Does that?
Yeah, it strikes me in your response that it is about control, and the fact that you have the ability with having ownership of those schools, that you can then ensure that that there is a Catholic Christian ethos within those schools.
Maybe the challenge I would make is that the word control has a very loaded sense to it. it's a responsibility. The word trustee is important. We hold in trust the responsibility to ensure that the character of that particular Catholic school reflects the choice that parents are making to choose a Catholic education system. There's nothing hidden in what we offer or what we do. So control, management, trust, responsibility. That's how we would say it, rather maybe the more euphemistic sense of control.
And I appreciate that you are working with the transfers and looking at drafting a paper around faith-based schools. And from the comments which you made, it suggested that perhaps the barrier is around ownership.
No, in fact, there's no barrier in principle in the discussions. The barrier was in law, that there was no model that the department had available to it here in Northern Ireland to date to allow that joint ownership, that joint trusteeship. But in fact, in the conversations, the discussions, and indeed in the responses to the department, both the transferors and the Catholic trustees have said that they would be very willing to engage on a joint trusteeship, joint ownership model in certain circumstances where that can be arranged. Yeah.
If I can just
could you
add
tell
to
us
that.
how a school such as that would operate? Who would have ownership of the school? Who would it be equal partners? And how would pupils be engaged within the school?
Well, those actually are questions which are part of the ongoing discussions, but I was just about to say that what we have is a very constrained range of governance models, and all through the ESA debate, one of the things that we wanted on the table was a wider range of governance models to reflect the greater diversity within our society. The questions which you're asking are the practical questions which this subcommittee, which the department are managing, are actually addressing at this moment in time. And the point I made about people coming from different perspectives and different environments, I think that is going to play into this discussion. The one thing that I think it's important for us to say is that CCMS as a body does not promote Catholic education. We are the advocate for what is there, if you like, for the sector. And I'm not going to go into the history of why we came about, but we came about largely because there was a perceived need by government. But I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that in engaging with the transferors, all of us are trying to exploit the common ground. And, you know, once we can close that ground to a point where there's agreement, then we will move forward. And I think the willingness is there to achieve that. And, I mean, it's the old phrase, it's a work in progress. But again, we have to go back to the fact, and again, it reflects on some of the things which Tim has said. Parents make choices. To ask why are there Catholic schools, you have to ask why are parents wanting to choose Catholic schools. And the same point will apply to people who choose other schools. And in some instances, parents choose schools because they regard them as secular. And that's a perfectly legitimate position to be in. And I think one of the challenges in Northern Ireland is that the control sector, because it is a state system in the broadest sense, has all of the nuances of our society and how that is to be encapsulated in an agreement with a sector which is overtly faith-based, I think is a challenge on the other side. So, I mean, I think what we need to be looking at here is how can we exploit the possibilities on that spectrum, as I described it, of sharing.
And how do you see joint faith schools differing from integrated schools?
Precisely on this very misunderstood point in the general concept of integrated education in Northern Ireland, as opposed to joint faith schools, and that is the legal construct guarantees the religious ethos. Control schools, as I understand it, most integrated schools are controlled in that sense. Is that right? That in other words, there's no legal protection to a religious ethos in those schools. And that's a popular misconception. People often think what they're talking about is joint faith schools. The spectrum, just to go back to your earlier question again, the spectrum of actual possible modes of implementation of a joint faith school are already operating very successfully in GB, in Scotland, England and Wales. And we are looking at those models, we're engaging with people involved in them. They tend to have a little bit of local variation, you know, depending on the balance of the population and so on. But the fundamental principle is joint ownership and agreed structures of management. And that is exactly the same thing as characterised the discussions to date with the transferors and the department into this new model. We have actively supported the transferors in reclaiming their space in the education sector in Northern Ireland. We can work together with another faith-based Christian entity, and people often wondered why the Catholic Church kind of held out, because we can't do that with a secular, fluid control sector, which has no interest in faith in that sense, other than in a very general societal sense. But we can do a joint ownership model with other Christian churches, and that represents the bulk of the society in Northern Ireland. So that's the difference. It's guaranteed in law.
You asked the difference between a joint faith-based school and an integrated school, and one of the key differences is that a joint faith-based school would have a distinctly Christian ethos in it, whereas an integrated school is a secular school. An integrated school should not be promoting any particular faith. In addition to that, I'll go back to an earlier point that you made, and the question is constantly asked, why do we have Catholic schools? Well, I sometimes ask the question, why should we not have Catholic education in Catholic schools? And if the argument against Catholic schools is based on economics, I think that CCMS has demonstrated through the area planning process that we are very, very conscious of our obligation to the economics of the argument. Secondly, are Catholic schools exclusive? No, they're not. Catholic schools are fully inclusive and becoming increasingly so. And I also think we need to recognise the contribution that Catholic education makes to society in general, and that contribution is recognised in over 80 countries throughout the world where a Catholic education system exists. So I think we need to be asking, why should we not have Catholic schools, as opposed to why do we have Catholic schools?
You're calling for the removal of the statutory duty to encourage and facilitate the development of integrated education. Would you say this should also be removed from Irish medium?
Over a period of time, I think all sectors that have had, if you like, a start-up have to reach a point where they're either going to fly or they're not. And I think whether it's Irish medium, integrated, even Catholic schools in a different model or whatever, I think there's a period of time when they should have that facility to have encouragement, if you like, through some form of support. But it has to come to an end at some point. Otherwise, you distort the system. And if we work on the principle that parents make choices in our society, we have to respect when parents start showing over a period of time what their trend in choices might be. And come back to the point that education is a publicly funded service. It must be efficient and it must deliver what its primary purpose is, and that is education. So on that basis, we think that the integrated sector have had a sufficiently long period of gestation. I think if it came to an end at a figure of 30, 35 years, then I think the same thing should apply to the Irish medium sector and to any other sectors. And indeed, you could argue that the legislation being considered in relation to shared schools should fall into the same category. You can promote certain things for a certain length of time. Now, as I've said, I'm not sure that making legislation is the best way of promoting a shared approach, but it's this concept that promotion for a while is useful, but it must then eventually stand on its own 2 feet, and it's a pure business model.
Okay. And just finally, the requirement for a Catholic certificate to teach in a primary school creates a barrier for integration of your staffing cohort. Have you given any consideration to change that, rather than it be an essential criteria, to perhaps be a desirable criteria?
I think we've said to this committee in the past that we are moving towards increasing the access to the certificate. And I think the point that Malachy makes is the entitlement to parents having access to a faith-based education by implication requires people to be developed in that particular ethos. And our belief is that people who are committed to the Catholic ethos, whether they are Catholics or not, can make a contribution to Catholic schools. So it's not a case of should we take the certificate away. The case is should we extend the access to that certificate, and that's the approach that we're taking.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kennan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. And much food for thought, but I do congratulate you on how successful the schools are and a lot of the suggestions that you put in your report. One of the key questions we've asked everyone is the actual definition that's in the bill. I wondered if you would comment. My concern is that by making it maintained and controlled or unionist, nationalist or socio-economic, we make the whole thing, we define people into groups rather than have a nice, more community-based idea which allows us in the bill to push merging everyone together and sharing with a community ethos. I wonder if you comment on that.
You're talking about the bill for shared education. Yeah. Malachy, do you want to?
I think maybe one comment I would make is that to take you back to some earlier points whereby the focus should be on delivering better provision to children. So where shared education is being proposed, it shouldn't necessarily stipulate that it needs to be shared between one community and another, because there will be opportunities where, there will be occasions when schools will not actually have the opportunity to share with a school from another sector because of their geographical location. So shared education should be viewed in a much broader sense. What opportunities exist for schools, either across sectors or within sectors, to share in order to provide better in terms of education provision for children.
Well, I think we should caveat that by saying that what I'd said earlier is we don't think that this necessarily would benefit from having legislation, but clearly a definition of what shared education means is important. And I think, I can't quite put my hands on it at the moment, but there is a definition which I think John Hughes from Queen's has proposed, which we would broadly be in agreement with. But again, it's parents making choices. We can't force that.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, really, to follow up on that, you've said, well, Jim specifically, you've said we don't need legislation, and yet Father Tim quite clearly says that the basis of Catholic education is it needs to be legislated for. We need, and part of the reason, as I understand it, of having shared education being pushed in the bill is because everyone needs a jolly good nudge to do more. In that we could argue that some of the things you're doing with joint faith schools and shared schools wouldn't have happened if we hadn't nudged heavily. And so what I look at your excellent schools, but 97% are Catholic. You've still got the certificate in place which you want to enlarge and rather than reduce. In area planning, your schools merge together rather than sharing with others. There are some excellent examples which happen, but they're tiny. And so what I'm really saying is this bill and the push by most of the parties for more sharing is to get this continuum or the spectrum that you talked about happening. I'm not sure where to go with a question on it, but do you not see the reason for why we need to just try and break down barriers rather than go for one set system?
Well, the point, I don't agree with you that this is happening because there's been a push. And indeed, one of the risks of putting something into a programme for government is that you set a target and you fail to achieve it. And that, that then makes the thing look...
if you don't set a target, no one bothers.
But there are targets being set, and this is one of the options that we have a piece of, it's not legislation, but we have an objective to create 10 campuses, for instance. Now, the point that we keep coming back to is we can only achieve these things if there is a willingness on the ground for people to support them, and if the conditions are right. And those conditions, in some cases, are set by government. For instance, there's no point in pulling two schools together to create another unsustainable school. There has to be a sustainability to it. And we have to remember that education is the primary purpose, not some kind of model which shows as a society we're becoming more tolerant of each other because we are going to be forced to work together. One of the points that I would make, the document Building Peace, Shaping the Future, which we'll leave with you, that goes back to 2001 and sets out very clearly the Catholic view of sharing, and it makes the case that Catholic schools are not schools for Catholics. And I think that same could be said of the control schools. They're not schools for anyone in particular. They are down to parental choice. Now, the reason that we don't think that legislation is helpful is that all of the steps that have occurred so far have occurred without legislation, and they've occurred without the threat of legislation. And I would contend that certainly in the post-primary sector, the thing which has probably accelerated this process most has been the SEP programme through Queen's, where there was a practical reason for doing it, which was extending the range of curricular choice in schools. And it has created an environment where children of different schools, of different uniforms, are walking up and down corridors in all kinds of schools every day and working together. And it's those practical things that are going to bring things forward, not legislation. There are, and I go back to Cody in 1998, you have to look at the local circumstances. In some cases, these things happen because there is a need. In other cases, you're kind of constructing a need. And EMU, I suppose, is an example of constructed need. It hasn't led to the expansion that would have been hoped for. So the point I'm making is that we constantly need to be changing how we can move forward. I think the really important thing that you're hearing from all of us, and I'm sure you've heard it from others who've sat in these chairs, is that there's a willingness now to work together. And indeed, if I can go back to the practical side of it, the kind of funding situation that we're facing creates another practical need. We're very responsive to that. But the point Malachy made, we cannot go out and promote a particular model. But what we can do is say that if the circumstances are right, other models may be considered. And I mean, if we and the board went to an area and said, look, this is what we're going to do, and there may be sufficient numbers to create a school, it's equally possible that the community will say, well, that's fine. If you want to do that, you go right ahead. But we're heading off that way to the nearest controlled school and that way to the nearest maintained school. So this has got to be a buy-in, and it's not something that can be imposed, which is why we make the point it's a bottom-up approach. Hearts and minds.
Just going back to your point about a definition, I found it here. The Centre for Shared Education in Queen's University said that shared education is broadly defined as any collaborative activity within or between schools or other educational institutions that can contribute towards school improvement, provide access to opportunity, encourage more effective use of resources and promote social cohesion. We think that that is an excellent definition of what shared education could be. In terms of legislation, there are occasions when legislation is required in order to ensure conformity. The consultation at the moment on bullying in schools, we believe that there is a strong case for legislation in relation to that in order to ensure that schools address that issue appropriately. But having legislation for something such as shared education brings me back to my point about the geographical location of some schools. If they are not able to engage in sharing, are they going to be penalised in some shape or form because it's in legislation and they're obliged to do it? And also, finally, your point about CCMS through area planning tending to rationalise schools within our own sector first. Well, that is our primary obligation under legislation. We're obliged under the 1989 order to plan for the development of Catholic schools. That is our primary responsibility. If opportunities present themselves, and those opportunities are coming from the community, CCMS is certainly committed to exploring opportunities for sharing in those contexts.
I have to bring the opportunities out in front of you then. Okay, I've got one other angle. Sorry.
Could I just add one further dimension to that? And it's the concept of the principle of subsidiarity and incentivisation. In other words, that law isn't always the best way. Law it can be quite a blunt instrument, as you well know. It's not always the best way, especially in terms of the principle of subsidiarity at local level, to get communities to engage in the way that you want. But incentivisation rather than obligation, while it may be a slower, steadier process, is still a very important and valid process. And I suppose what we're arguing is, for the time being, incentivisation is a better way to go than legislation.
And a very short, who are the subcommittee you talk about? What other groupings are on it? Are integrated on it? Are voluntary grammars on it? Are Irish on it? Or is it just the controlled and yourselves?
Well, I'm not on it, so I don't know precisely. But I think the main thrust here is to develop the model of joint faith schools. So I think it's mainly transfers, trustees in the department at this stage.
Mr. Lunn?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. You're very welcome, as usual. I think I'd better say at the outset I do regard all three of you as a friend, because by the time we finish, it might be open to questions. Could you pass on our condolences to Jerry Lundy, who I think is our constituent of mine?
Election.
No limit.
No, frankly, Chairman, no. Passing on condolences.
No, sorry, it was just...
Is not. Having said that, I find your whole attitude to parental choice in particular dispiriting, not to say depressing. You seem to favour the principle of parental choice when it means that parents choose a Catholic school, but you don't apply the principle when parents decide that they'd like to send their children to an integrated school. And in particular, you don't apply the principle if a Catholic school was to opt for transformation or amalgamation with a school from another sector, you would not allow it. And that is pretty clear, Malachy, from what you have said today and in the past. So do you not feel you're being slightly hypocritical in terms of parental choice as a principle?
The parental choice that we're describing is the parental choice expressed by parents when they choose a school. I think some of what you're saying is about what you might call an area planning approach and giving an incentive to...
parental choice, that they clearly expressed will of a group of parents in a particular school or two schools as to how they would see the way forward.
Well, you're going back now to the 1989 order and the transformation. Well, we've always regarded that as an unfortunate piece of legislation which actually diminishes the rights of the trustees, as Tim has pointed out. Groups of parents can be mobilised in a whole range of ways. What we're talking about are individuals expressing a view. Now, I accept that in some circumstances, how you create an integrated school may be difficult because, as has been said before, there are what might be called the two big blocks there. But that will has worked right going back to the very inception of the integrated movement. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for people within a community to lobby for that right, and we would support that. But what we do not support is trying to undermine our own sector for that to be achieved. And I think, I've made the point that CCMS does not have a responsibility to promote Catholic education. Our responsibility is to ensure that we've got good quality Catholic schools. So, and the other point I would make, and I'll not make a reference to the specific circumstance, but if this is going to happen, if there's to be transformation, it should be on the basis of the policies that exist. If we're going to create schools, we've got to create sustainable schools, and we shouldn't be coming in behind legitimate proposals within policy to unnerve a community and create a circumstance which is, according to policy, not achievable.
If two schools in a particular area decided that they would like to amalgamate on an integrated basis, and if 3/4 of the parents in your maintained school opted for that, you would still block it.
If they were choosing to build a school...
Yes or no, would you or would you not?
If they were choosing to build a school, that is a matter for the community to decide. If they want to take over a Catholic school, then there is an issue that we'd have to address.
No, you would prefer to... If that was the preferred solution amongst the parents, you would still prefer to close the Catholic maintained school if it wasn't viable and move the children to the nearest Catholic maintained school, whatever distance away it was.
I think
that's a...
Yeah, Malachy's made the point that is our legislative...
I just want to clarify that.
That is our legislative position.
There are no circumstances in which you will countenance the transformation of a Catholic maintained school to integrated status.
Could I ask? I'm not aware of any circumstance where we've actually stood in the way of that. I'm not aware of any circumstance where CCMS has actually stood in the way of the Catholic maintained school.
Can you evidence that particular claim that you're applying to us?
I'm asking.
You're making a claim, Trevor. You're not asking. You're making a claim. You've said what we would do and what we would not do. Evidence the claim.
I'm putting it to you. Let's just go to the Moy situation. It'd be an interesting one, because that was the vote there amongst the parents was actually quite close. It was getting very near to half the parents across the two schools who preferred an integrated option. But it went in favour of the rather bizarre arrangement that we're now going to be stuck with in a few years' time. What would you have done had the parents opted the other way, that they would like to see an integrated solution down there?
So you can't evidence your claim.
I'm not making a claim.
You did make a claim.
I'm asking you what you would have done.
No, you told us what we would do in your earlier statements.
In relation to the Moy, I'm not aware of any vote taking place.
Well, the votes...
Certainly in our school.
The votes that were cast are on the file of the two headmasters at the Moy. And also on the file is your complete opposition to the whole principle until it became obvious that something had to be done.
Our opposition to it?
Yes.
Well, I would be very, very interested in actually seeing that documentation.
I think you can...
With respect, Trevor, I would have expected if we came here to respond to something like that, you would present us with the detailed evidence and the papers and so on to sustain it. I mean, you're asking us to deal with very hypothetical situations. We have clearly affirmed our respect for the principle of parental choice. How that works out in any particular local circumstance will be an incredibly complex question, and it will also involve responsibility to answering questions such as, well, if 50%, to use a scenario you suggested, of parents want to go for a particular integrated model, what's going to happen with the other 50%? Are they going to support that? Will that lead to a sustainable school and so on? There's a whole range of complex questions arise in that regard. We have affirmed consistently our respect for the right of parents to choose, our respect for the integrated sector. We have also indicated our willingness to look at new models where faith-based education can be sustained, that there will be new options emerging for communities to consider in those situations. But I don't appreciate coming here and being told what we would do when you don't have evidence to sustain it. That you're willing to present here in detail.
I've asked you what you would do.
I would expect a more responsible approach from a public representative.
Could I just make one point, maybe before you ask Ian, Trevor?
I'm looking at the clock.
In the one instance where I'm aware of that situation actually arising, CCMS actually advised the governors of the schools concerned as to the process that they would need to undertake in order to explore the possibility of becoming an integrated school. So we have never stood in the way of any developments within the integrated sector.
Can I just make a point, Trevor? I think this last few minutes has encapsulated the issue that for those who want the purity of a model, there are difficulties. What we're talking about is how can we take steps forward that our communities are going to support. And there are a range of these that are emerging, and they don't have to be about changing governance or anything like that. It can simply be that you exploit the facilities of a community together to achieve the best outcomes for young people within that community.
I'm not interested in the purity of the model. I would like to see our children on a much greater scale being educated together. That's not happening in your schools.
Trevor, I have to disagree with you on that. You cannot have sharing in this society without the Catholic sector being intimately involved in it, and indeed without the controlled sector.
Let me move on just slightly. I'm sure you'll tell me that you've all been in an integrated school.
Yes.
Yes.
My first teaching post was in Hazelwood College.
All right. Now, you seem to have a problem about the quality of the faith education in integrated schools, which is completely at odds, I must say, with anything that I've ever seen in extensive visits to integrated schools. It just is not the case. They deal with religion and faith in a very balanced way, and they also prepare your sector children for the sacraments in a way that, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I understand, there is no objection to from the Catholic Church. Is that the case? What's your problem with allowing Catholic children to be educated in an integrated setting?
But we haven't got a problem. Parents make the choice. I mean, I think the point that, and I'll let Tim speak for himself, the point that he was making was that the commitment to ethos in a Catholic school is very clear. It cannot be quite so clear when you're dealing with a much broader range of background, including people, and this applies to all our sectors as well, from ethnic backgrounds that are not Christian at all.
I would challenge your fundamental assumption that integrated schools are religious schools in law.
They're not religious schools in law.
That's the point.
They're not.
Well, can I finish?
Yes.
So, a Catholic school is a school that is defined, founded and based on the religious mission of that school. It is the fundamental characteristic, founding characteristic and principle of that school. That is a fundamental qualitative difference that parents are free to choose between in terms of an integrated school and a Catholic school. Within an integrated school, if, as a person of faith, if I had children and I was considering where I would place them in terms of that spectrum, a question in my mind would be, well, in an integrated school, as currently constituted, as opposed to a joint church school, for example, as an alternative, could I rely on the stability of the approach of that integrated school towards the whole issue of religion and my faith disposition? Because that's a movable feast in terms of what the Board of Governors at any particular time in response to society and societal emphasis and change and all the rest of it does. A Catholic school remains a Catholic school in its. So that's a fundamental qualitative difference in terms of the religious question that you ask. We're not casting aspersions on the quality of religious education in a integrated school.
It sounded that way. I respect your faith schools. I respect the Catholic maintained sector, and I respect the right of parents to send their children there. It's the reciprocation of that view that worries me, frankly. And I don't get it from you. And I wish, Chairman, that we could have a longer discussion with these guys, because it's unfortunate about the funeral, and of course you have to go. But look, I'll leave it there because there's others. But really, we need to talk more about this.
Can I just make one final point? Trevor, if we're looking at the purity of an integrated school, as I've described it at the far end of the spectrum, then what we're saying is that's not always achievable, and particularly within a limited time scale. What we're saying is that the commitment to get to a more shared, inclusive, respected and respectful society is through steps that can be taken in different circumstances at different paces. And we are supportive of that. So we have the same long-term objective, but we believe that along the way there are certain things that we need to ensure are in place, because that's what parents want.
Yeah, that's what.
Just mindful of Trevor's comment, and also the fact that you need to leave, and we have several other members who wish to ask questions.
Well, we can stay longer.
Would it be possible to reschedule if you to come back for an additional session?
How much longer would you like? I mean, we can arrive late, obviously, to the funeral. We can accommodate that. We'd rather deal with it, I think, this morning.
If we could.
Yes, yeah.
I could do another half hour.
Okay, we can go with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just for Trevor.
Thanks, Peter. For
let others have it.
We'll see how we get on with the rest of the session just at this stage. Mr. Sheehan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, gentlemen, for coming in. Tim, you mentioned in your opening statement that the main sector is based on Christian values, love of God, of neighbour and self, yet it continues to this iniquitous practice of academic selection. If we're talking about segregation within the education system, in my view, this is the worst. And I understand that boards of governors are in control of schools and can set the entrance criteria themselves. But at the end of the day, I've spoken to many principals, former principals, teachers, and former teachers. Particularly from the non-selective background, and they feel that the Catholic hierarchy has let them down terribly.
Well, I would challenge that absolutely and unequivocally. The Catholic hierarchy has been to as you call it, the Catholic bishops and trustees collectively, have been to the forefront of actually supporting the transition away from academic selection. That is their formal stated position, which your party doesn't fail to claim and point to. So I'm surprised that you're making that claim this morning. I accept, however, that the trustees' ability to change in law on this matter, in accordance with their policy, is limited because it is the Board of Governors, as you properly say, who have that responsibility. Those boards of governors include
department representatives appointed by the minister from your party, and so there's an influence that can be had there. It includes other representatives, legitimately, importantly, from parents, from teachers, and so on and so forth. So again, there's a part of this is clearly about winning hearts and minds and the argument, but the position of the Catholic trustees has been unequivocal, it has been clear, and no other sector, Pat, no other sector has moved as much as the Catholic sector has, and we can point to any number of schools that have begun that process already and are committed to it. Regrettably, there are others who will take longer on this journey, but the trustees, as trustees, are fully committed to that policy.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you about other sectors, and I mean, our view on that is very clear, but I am concerned about the sector that you represent, and, you know, in spite of the honeyed words about what
which your party quotes regularly,
which the Catholic, what you have said about the Catholic bishops. In actual fact, I mean, in terms of removing academic selection, you have been very, very unsuccessful in doing so, apart from a small number of instances.
Well, I mean, St Killian's on the North Antrim coast in this diocese has transformed. St Patrick's in Armagh, Loreto in Coleraine. There are others in the pipeline, wasn't there? Lurgan, yeah, Lurgan would be a case in point. These things don't.
And what percentage is that of
these
the
things
overall
these things don't happen overnight. These things don't happen overnight, just by their very nature.
What percentage is that?
Your own minister has a role in this. In terms of we don't have the majority on these boards.
What percentage is it?
What's that?
What percentage is it of the overall grammar?
Your own minister has been very slow in appointing his representatives to these boards.
Tim, what percentage of Catholic grammars have done away with academic selection?
I can't put a percentage on that.
No,
I can't
that's
put a
the
percentage.
question I'm asking.
No, but you suggested your words were that the Catholic hierarchy or the Catholic trustees, because it's more than just the bishops involved here, it's the religious orders, that they were not committed to this. Their repeated public position on this matter is unequivocal. So I challenge your position and your claim in that regard.
You see, the evidence is in the outcome, and, you know, the Catholic bishops or the trustees can say what they wish, but people will look at the evidence in terms of the number of schools that have changed. And it has been a tiny, tiny percentage. Even some schools have recently rolled back from commitments to reduce the numbers being taken into the schools through academic selection. So, you know,
yes,
we're moving backwards.
The Board of Governors of some of those schools. Not the word you used was the Catholic hierarchy, not the Catholic hierarchy, well, not the trustees.
Why then are so many people from the teaching profession disappointed in the role that the Catholic trustees and the Catholic bishops
because
have played in all of this?
They may misunderstand the level of legislative responsibility or authority that trustees have to influence that particular decision.
Well, we're not talking about legislative influence. We're talking about influence by the bishops with people who are on boards of governors.
The Board of Governors has the responsibility. Full stop. We can only encourage...
And you have no influence.
Of course we have influence, and we have sought to use that influence to our best endeavours. Well, just as you as politicians, well, would you like me to litany the range of areas in which your own minister or your own party or politicians generally fail to achieve what they want? We're all in the same boat. We're committed to it. And I would think it would be better if we worked collaboratively rather than using this as some political point-scoring thing about the Catholic trustees. But if that's what you want to do, fair enough. Our position is unequivocal on this matter. It is clear, and we regard it as something at the essence of equality and sharing. And it's interesting that this committee, hasn't made a big issue. Or indeed, in terms of educational policy, the same issue isn't there to the same extent as the idea of promoting integrated schools in that narrow sense. So, I'm sorry, Pat, I can only say that our position is unequivocal, it is clear, and to our best endeavours we're trying to influence the situation.
Could I just say something on this? CCMS position on this is absolutely unequivocal, and I can share your frustration. I have maybe a better understanding of some of the impediments because we are moving this agenda forward insofar as we can, but we do not have the influence over those boards of governors. I think one of the things we have to remember here is that this is outside of policy, because if it was a policy matter, you would be deliberating on it and giving us the scaffolding, if you like, to move forward on this. But I think that we've ended up in a philosophical discussion here, which is not the way I think this whole issue needs to be handled. I think as a society, we have to recognise that our economy is very important to us. We create a settled, peaceful society when we have people who have a place and a stake in that society. And education is very important in creating that economy which allows that to happen. My concern is that many of our very able young people are being disadvantaged in the society because the view of what our economy needs is not reflected in many cases within the curriculum of our schools. And Trevor, just to take an example of how the integrated sector works effectively with the rest of the sectors, there was a piece of work conducted about a year, 18 months ago in Hazelwood, where they were making a bid for a joint STEM centre, and they canvassed.
Still going ahead.
They canvassed the curriculum offer of all of the schools in the wider North Belfast area, and it was quite stark, the difference between the subject choice available in the voluntary grammar sector and the grammar sector as a whole, and that available in the non-selective sector. We have to get an alignment between our economy, our education system, and indeed Nelson's former department, what goes on in DSD, to create the circumstances to ensure that young people are included in our education system right the whole way through. And when I talk about parental choice, I talk about parental choice that is available to everyone. We have inequality in that some young people are excluded from certain schools, and their exclusion in many cases diminishes the range of choice available to the other young people in those schools. So for educational and economic reasons, we need to put education at the heart of this issue, and we need to promote the concept of inclusion and equality in our education system so that we have an economy and a society that is at peace with itself. Now, the steps towards that are steps that the politicians primarily have a responsibility for. We in the Catholic sector are doing our damnedest against policy to create those circumstances. So, Pat, I understand your frustration, but I would prefer that we see the steps that have been taken rather than to be decrying the steps that have yet to be taken.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thanks for that, Tim. Jim and Malik, you're very welcome. Can I go back to a point raised by the Chair and also by Trevor in terms of the Moy campus? Does CCMS and do you support the Moy campus as it is now, their proposals?
Well, the proposal from Moy could not have gone ahead without the support of both CCMS and the Southern Education and Library Board, so we are fully supportive. And could I just say, in relation to the Moy, the sharing that has gone on in the Moy predates the shared education, the shared campus initiative, and also the shared education initiative, and we see that as a strength for the Moy, hence our support for it.
Thank you. I'm sure you haven't got it today, but in terms of particularly in terms of our post-primary schools, what percentage of our post-primary schools would have 10%, say, coming from the non-Catholic community?
Well, we don't have the figures, but there are differentials in different areas. There's one school that have a very significant non-Catholic population. But I think the point that we make is the door is open. It's for parents to make that choice, and it's not about counting numbers. It's about asking, are you satisfied with the education that's available in this school?
I probably should have declared an interest, having spent 30 years in the Catholic sector, that I fully support, and also as the chair of a CCMS Primary School Board of Governors. And I was surprised, Malik, when you said that in terms of sharing that you were more reactive than proactive. I'm thinking particularly of the St Columbanus in Bangor. I was surprised that you use reactive rather than proactive.
Well, we're reactive in terms of the latest initiatives with regard to shared education. The success of a shared education campus, for example, rests very, very firmly in the community support for it. So as Jim said earlier on, we cannot go down to a community and say this is something that we want to impose on you. We have to react to the community coming to us and say this is an initiative that we would like you to support us in taking forward. So in that sense, we are reactive.
Can I say that we're very proactive in other ways? Because the spectrum of access to the curriculum is something that we very clearly support. through area learning communities and through initiatives through individual schools. And I mean, I think within area learning communities, it's not just the religious mix; it's the class mix that is an issue. And many of the constraints are imposed by schools making their own decisions. And I think one of the things that this committee needs to be aware of, not just in relation to the sharing model, but in relation to access to the curriculum, is that schools possibly have too much autonomy in the wrong areas. And I'm not suggesting that we handle this by legislation in terms of shared education, but I do think that we need to look at governance models and what the rights of governors are, with the belief that it's not the school that's important, it's the child accessing an education through schools. And we don't see area planning as the planning of buildings, we see area planning as the planning of access to the curriculum. And if that means working with sectors outside the Catholic sector, so be it, but that's what we see area planning being about.
And I suppose finally, Tim, supporters of secular education see that religion should be taken out of the school context altogether. And when we were in Dublin, a particular sector down there, if they want to have religious instruction of any sort, they can use the school premises after school. Some of these people believe that it should be left to the parish and what's your view on that?
Well, Catholic schools have evolved in response to a sufficient number of parents wanting their children in a given place to be brought up in a Catholic school environment. So the Catholic school, in that sense, in relation to the faith formation of a child, which includes its cultural and social formation, is a response, as we said earlier, to this fundamental human right of parents, and cooperates with the community of faith in a parish. It is at the service of that community of faith as well, and that's why, particularly in the primary level, that the link is so close there between the parish and the primary school. And that is actually something fundamental to Catholicism. We believe in a community-based vision of Christian faith, that you can't just live a Christian life in isolation. You're part of a community. And in that sense, the community has a right also to a space where it can be itself. And that's why I said earlier that this is part of a wider discussion about what we mean by a pluralist and diverse society. And you mentioned kind of the secular trend. My personal experience is that often under the guise of a claim that secularism and secularity is a neutral space, it actually becomes an incredibly intolerant space of religion and religiosity, which itself is a human right and fundamental to our human existence. And I think that comes through into this debate a little bit about shared and integrated education, that some secular views that want to get religion out of schools altogether do not recognise or accept the human right of parents to have their children brought up in accordance with their faith, and they actually just don't respect. Actually, they really don't respect faith, and they go further and make the claim that uniquely faith in our world and in our society is a source of tension and division, when we could point to many secular societies, atheistic societies, which have had their own bloodbaths on very different axes. So we need to get beyond that simplistic claim, which sometimes lurks behind this whole shared integrated thing, and particularly sometimes is actually a cloak for an anti-Catholicism in particular. Not always, but sometimes can be that. It's manifested, for example, in the complete failure when visitors are brought internationally to Northern Ireland as visitors. Take Obama, for example, President Obama, when he came over as part of the G8, or the G8, was it the G8 or the G9, when they came to Enniskillen? They were brought to the integrated school, passed by the control school, passed by the Catholic school. Why? Well, they're the problem. That's the message that's so often communicated. I'm saying that they never were the problem, that they have a social responsibility that they do their best to live out in terms of contributing to the common good, and we need to end this attitude, which frankly is offensive, that faith-based schools are of their very nature divisive. They are completely consistent with and contribute, are actually a sign of authentic diversity and pluralism, and I will defend the right of those schools to exist in response to the community choice of a group of parents in sufficient numbers.
Could I maybe just add to that having taught Catholic schools through very, very difficult times, I would go so far as to say that certainly the school that I taught in made a very, very significant contribution to ensuring that various situations did not become worse.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Newton.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome the delegation to the committee today. Thank them for coming, particularly under difficult circumstances. I suppose, Chair, I have only one question, and you've partially dealt with it. But you'd be aware that the transferors, as represented by the three main Protestant denominations, actually outlined to us, but didn't give us any detail on what might be a faith-based initiative that they seemed quite confident was going to go ahead. You've referred to it today. I'm not sure your confidence is as high as their confidence was, but you might want to say that or add to that. But you've made reference to the Catholic ethos running throughout the school and permeates the school in terms of our how the school operates, how the school delivers, and indeed the whole ethos of the school. If you're supportive of a faith-based school amongst other faiths, and that would be limited to presumably the Christian faith.
In terms of our own schools,
yeah. I mean, if you can explain if you are committed to moving towards a faith-based school,
yes,
which will have other denominations
yes.
involved in it.
Yes.
It would be a Christian faith-based school, yes. presumably. Now, if that is the case, and it has the various denominations within it, then how can the Catholic ethos run throughout every aspect of school life?
Well, that's an issue that obviously we've dealt with already in these examples over in GB, in Scotland, England and Wales. There is obviously a spectrum of provision in this regard, a spectrum in which that is permeated through the school. But it is completely consistent with Catholic theology that we would share with other Christians in the enterprise of the common purpose of education, built around agreed values. There's so much that we agree on, that we can build on, that we're committed to building on together, that we can do that. And this is going back actually to what George Bain, I think, said. There's a dynamism in education, and in faith-based education. We're not just sort of stuck in a particular form or mode of Catholic education per se. And part of being Catholic is to be ecumenical, is to be involved with our sisters and brothers in the Christian church. Part of that is also to open up our schools as they exist as Catholic schools, but also very much as potentially joint Christian schools to the wider society, so that they would be welcoming of a diversity of pupils, and that again is reflected in the experience in GB. But again, the fundamental issue is a negotiated agreement about how the Christian ethos is protected, respected, and present, and that it's there as the defining character of the school in law.
But if within the CCMS schools, that the Catholic ethos is the one which is dominant.
Yes.
If you make a move in partnership with others,
yes.
then one Christian values ethos cannot dominate.
No, sorry, maybe I didn't. I'll try and explain it more succinctly. Because it's with another Christian church, with whom we already share so much in common in terms of the basic values that are fundamental to the education enterprise. Because then we can work on so much together, provide a common environment, if you like, with particular negotiated ways and spaces, and in each school in the GB context, this is calibrated slightly differently in each school for the particular identity then of the Christian tradition within that to be reflected. So, in other words, it's because it's precisely another Christian church with whom we share so much in common, or other Christian churches, that we can still make sure that the Christian ethos, where it's common, is the dominant ethos pervading the whole community and mission of that school.
And I know it is in an international context, but the example you provided yourself of the school in Gaza,
yes,
which obviously doesn't have a Catholic ethos, but yet...
Well, it does. It does.
That's the point.
But then the pupils aren't Muslim then.
Yeah, but this is why the whole concept of mutual respect is, as I explained at the very beginning, is implicit to what a Catholic school is about, and that includes respect for other religious faiths. But to cite Monsignor Musalam, actually, on that visit, he said they regarded it as a very serious breach if any child, Christian or Muslim, showed disrespect to the other in terms of their religious convictions. But I think this is what people find difficult, maybe just to kind of get their head around. It is fundamental to the character of a Catholic school that it is tolerant and respectful. And this is why it is so hurtful and unjust, the claim that we are actually sectarian and a source of conflict in society. You know?
I would just hope all educationalists were tolerant and respectful to children from whatever background.
So, for example, and again, there's a mediation. I mean, to take the school in Gaza, no one, because it's there as a Catholic school, no one can challenge the idea that there would be for Christian children, for the Catholic children in that school, that there would be a celebration of Mass, that the seasons and feasts of the Christian calendar would be celebrated and acknowledged, and so on and so forth. But that school, precisely because it is Catholic, will also welcome the Muslim community and give them the space to celebrate their faith and tradition. And as long as it's all done with mutual respect, and that's fundamental to a Catholic school everywhere. That's the point I'm trying to make. So individual circumstances can be calibrated and negotiated according to the individual situation.
I'm then trying to get my head around in that example, and you've just taken me to that example, what the difference is between an integrated school and a shared faith school.
The faith dimension is protected in law. It's not a secular state school.
I'm saying that as I don't share Trevor's views, but yes. I mean, in the example you gave,
yes.
I'm now wondering, where's the difference?
Many integrated schools, as I acknowledged, achieve a similar thing, but that will depend on the particular Board of Governors at any given time. It's not guaranteed in law, And it can be subject, and we have international experience, it can be subject to the shifting sands of the state and the government of the place that you're in, how that is actually allowed for, accepted or tolerated. Let's imagine for a moment you've got an atheistic, communist, aggressive government coming in to a particular place and didn't respect religion, it would have more difficulty in its own legislative process in undermining a faith-based school in law than it would to a school that it controls and owns. Does that make sense?
Well, it's a fairly extreme example.
Well, sorry, but we're in the luxurious position, if I may say, that, as the Chair mentioned at the beginning, that there's actually a great symbiosis in terms of the values that all of our schools share, and that's a great thing. Yeah.
Just to let you know, there are 4 further members have indicated, so I'm just mindful of your time if you're not watching your time.
Go ahead.
Mr. McCausland.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's been very interesting this morning to hear the presentation, and I think it reflects something that has been obvious in other presentations on other days, that once you start to look at the issue of shared education, a whole range of other issues about education suddenly open up and you start to discuss them. So it's been quite stimulating in that wider regard. First of all, just to ask, there was a figure quoted somewhere in here of around 2.5% of children at Catholic maintained schools were from probably a Protestant background, or 2 point something or other. I was at a Catholic maintained school there on Friday, which they were quoting a figure around 10%. But is it? And there was also mention of the school. There's a grammar school up in Port Stewart somewhere.
What's up?
Again, which mentioned
Close to 40% at Dominican College, Port Stewart.
College,
yes,
yeah. And the other one was Dominican College, North Belfast. I'm not sure. Was the one in Port Stewart called that?
Yeah, that's Dominican. Yes, that's Dominican. Yeah,
they're both Dominican College. Is it a higher figure in? I know we haven't got precise figures and so on, but does it tend to be focused in grammar schools,
No.
or is it? I couldn't think of
primary, secondary, and we could point to examples in every level, you know.
And in our paper, any statistics quoted in our paper would refer simply to Catholic maintained schools. They wouldn't refer to grammar schools.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if it's 10, 20, 30% in a number of grammar schools, that would skew the thing obviously higher. It must be lower in some other other schools. Second question then was, in terms of Catholic ethos, it's very much the governors who run the school. How do you ensure that the Catholic ethos plays out?
Yes. Well, that would be, first of all, it's part of the legal ownership structure. And then in terms of the trustee representatives, they would be all and the scheme of management of the school. All of the members of the Board of Governors would be expected to respect Catholic ethos of the school and its fundamental mission in that regard. But in theory, the trustee representatives are there to ensure that is presented and mediated, if you like. But every member of the Board of Governors would have that responsibility.
What percentage of the Board of Governors would be trustees?
4 out of the 9, isn't that right?
Yeah.
4 out of 9. 4 out of the 9. Yeah.
And the other 5 are made up of
department representatives. Yes.
In the maintained sector, the department and the board of the Education Authority. The Education Authority doesn't have a seat. The voluntary grammar sector, and then parents and teachers or staff.
I think it's 2 department. 2 education library board. 4 trustees.
4 trustees, yeah, 4 trustee reps.
And then a parent governor and a teacher governor.
Right. Okay.
Could I just go back to a point? The importance of leadership in a school is vital, and in terms of whether the governors have that overarching responsibility for the management of the school and ensuring that the ethos is evident in the school, the prime responsibility then comes down to the leader in the school, the principal.
It brings me on to another question then. In terms of the proposal for joint schools, joint faith schools, would there have to be some change in current legislation to enable that to happen on this model that they have in GB?
The only model that we can use from current legislation is a maintained school model, not a Catholic maintained school model, but a maintained school model, which is in current legislation. But, I mean, it is jumping through hoops a little bit. But I refer to my earlier comments that we would have wanted, and still would want to see, a much wider range of governance arrangements in our system. But to do it at this moment in time, it would be a maintained school.
So you have a maintained school, you can have a maintained school in Northern Ireland which is not a Catholic maintained school?
Yeah, there are a number actually, I think there are only 6 or so schools which are maintained and not Catholic.
And would there, without the, so there would not be a need for a change in legislation to create one of these?
There wouldn't, but it's messy. I've said, we'd have to jump through a few hoops to get the...
Could you, without going into all the technical detail, can you give me just a summary of what that gets at?
Well, it is very technical, and on that basis, it would be difficult to do that, other than to say that it is legally possible to do it.
Right.
But it is stretching the forbearance of all the partners, including the law, to be able to do it.
I'll maybe have a conversation separately about that, because I'm just curious as to how it would work. That was all. The final point was this. In terms of Catholic schools, there are a number that I have visited which are extremely, I think, inclusive in their approach to things and welcoming and so on. And that's good. And I've been encouraged by the visits to them. There have been a couple of instances of things happening in a Catholic school which certainly I felt were inappropriate in terms of the instance last year of a school where there was an event around the Irish language being linked to a hunger striker. And if you have 4 trustees out of 9, I would have thought it would be possible to deal with those situations, but I'm just interested in your comment on that.
Well, I think it's always difficult to deal with individual situations and say that is representative of a view, and I don't think it would be appropriate for us to go into the detail of that. But the question has to be how that decision was made, on what evidence or basis that decision was made, and I think the intention of all of our schools is to play a constructive part within society, within the communities that they exist. Sometimes the media can create headlines, and I dare say you've been subject to that yourself, Nelson, which give a view of something, and issues become media issues, which actually on the ground are very different. And as I've said, I don't think it's appropriate to go into the detail, sure. But I think what it proves is that these are very exceptional events where things go wrong, that the vast majority, and I'm using your own language here, of schools that you've visited show that inclusivity, and that's our intention. We all can stumble along the way, and I think what we need to be focusing on here is that which is positive, that which unites us, that which allows inclusivity and sharing to be promoted and to be sustained.
Just 2 points on the wider issue of the difference in intensity of commitment that you've experienced in schools. I mean, that comes back, I think, to the earlier point I made about incentivisation and particularly maybe resourcing more fully leadership training in our schools, because that's what makes the critical difference, particularly principals, but not exclusively in this area. So I'd make that suggestion to the committee today that they might want to make recommendations in this regard about leadership training in schools in this area. I think that would be very welcome. Then in relation to the other matter that you raised, and without going into any specifics, our schools across our society are located within particular communities. It is important that they deal with the reality of our historical, political and cultural issues. They can't be apart from. They were very anxious and successfully maintained what I would describe as an oasis during the height of our violent conflict over the years, one that was very welcome for everybody, and everybody generally tried to respect that. However, now in a more normalised political environment, they have a responsibility, and I think that's what your basic fundamental thesis is here, to be part of that building up a shared cohesive society. And they can't ignore the political tensions and realities that are there in the society. The only thing we would say then as trustees, if I may, is that it's vital, though, that those issues are dealt with in an appropriate, professional, constructive, agreed way. And anything, no matter how localised it might be and justified in terms of a community's tradition locally, I think that should always be dealt with and those types of issues should always be dealt with as part of an overall process and part of this overall process of sharing and how we deal with the past and the future, rather than bouncing people into situations that create difficulties.
I think as well, we all aspire to an ideal, and we recognise that there will be times when schools do not reach that ideal. And what we try to encourage schools to do with respect to being a Catholic school is to evaluate themselves as a Catholic school in exactly the same way as they would evaluate the standard of literacy in the school or numeracy or whatever. And in cases where things do go wrong, we would be encouraging schools to ask the question, well, why did that go wrong? And how could that situation be changed or avoided in the future?
Chair, just to say, accepting Terry Jim's point there that we all do stumble. That's human nature. I think the key thing there is to learn from the stumble and to make sure we don't do it again.
Yep.
Yeah. But I'd be anxious, though, just if I may again, on that one, to say that local communities and their local histories across our society, that they are part of that school community, and they will have a view about their own particular history and values and emphasis and so on in this area. All I'm saying is that has to be respected and thought through. But the trustees of Catholic schools would be very anxious that those difficult and very sensitive issues would be part of the mainstream, not something that is bounced on or imposed on, particularly in our case, a Catholic school, for example, without consultation and being dealt with in this more mainstream way.
Thank you. Mrs. Overend.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for, it's good to see you here this morning. I just wanted to, after conversations previously on from that, I really wasn't aware that there was many Catholic maintained schools that were welcoming to those of non-Catholic faith, and I wasn't aware of the Dominican College that you referred to earlier, 40%. So I just wanted to ask, is this a policy direction then that CCMS is now promoting, and across all your schools in Northern Ireland, and are you actively then engaging with schools outside the Catholic maintained sector controlled schools, because a lot of them have now a mixture of religions on them. So are you engaging with those schools then to try and get more into?
There are two issues. First of all, in terms of enrolment in schools, I've made the point that we do not promote the Catholic sector per se. Schools can promote themselves within their own communities. And on that basis, the comparative success of the Catholic sector at this moment in time, on all the measures, and I'm not saying they're the right measures, but all the measures that we have, the Catholic sector is outperforming other sectors despite higher levels of social deprivation. So, parents could respond to that and they can make their decisions within their own areas. In terms of collaborating with controlled schools, I think that's the thing that has moved forward substantially in the last 10 years. I was a member of the Costello Group back in 2002-03, and as part of the background work that we did, we commissioned the department to go out and look for examples of good practice of sharing across our schools, and they could actually find very few. Probably 5 was probably as many as I can recall. Many of those were quite tenuous. If you were to conduct a similar exercise today, you would see a myriad of sharing across all of the sectors. And I think that's the move forward. That has been led by the schools. Whether it has been led by initiatives such as the Queen's Atlantic Philanthropies Initiative or other local initiatives. There are initiatives in the North Eastern Board, for instance, which I think have been very successful. These things are characteristic of our education system as a whole, which is why we think the sharing agenda has been driven by need, by practical need, by a response to practical situations, which may be including funding. So circumstances have moved on, and we've a society which is much more open to that. And very importantly, that openness is more evident very often amongst the young people themselves rather than their parents, who've grown up, many of them through the Troubles, with a concern about safety and all the rest of it, and that has had an impact on our system over the years. But we're growing up through that, so, which is one of the reasons why we feel that we must be full partners in that spectrum of sharing. At whatever level we can engage within a particular community.
I'm just getting what I'm taking from what you're saying, that your priority is to enhance the shared education projects across schools in an area rather than to actually promote people of non-Catholic faith coming into the Catholic
it's an open
schools.
door.
Is that right?
Yeah, the building piece shaping the future, I think, said it. It's an open door. Schools are there. If people want to avail of the ethos of that school, they're very welcome to do so. And I mean, what the statistics don't tell us are the number of people from different ethnic backgrounds, the Chinese community, the Indian community, who for many years have been part of both the controlled and the Catholic system. So it's people making choices. But I think the key thing here is that what we are promoting is access to education.
Thank you. Mr. Craig.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. Apologies for being late, gentlemen. Listened with great interest to what was being said there. I suppose to get to the fundamentals of all of this, because there's an inquiry about shared education more than it is about integration, and I'm not getting into that argument. I suppose, Father Bartlett, to yourself, really, you've made that strong argument about the faith-based education that comes with the Catholic maintained sector, and you know that's people's choices. I have no issue with that. In a shared situation, though, that does bring forth, I suppose, unique opportunities. I was told never to use the word difficulties. Unique opportunities. And there was a hint from the controlled sector representatives whenever they give evidence to the committee here. One of those, obviously, is the Catholic certificate. How do you operate, you know, a school that is shared by both the controlled and the main and maintained sector if there's a need for a Catholic certificate in there, which some teachers just don't have and don't particularly want to have either? Is there going to be a resolution to that? Because that's what was hinted.
Well, just on the wider point, you know, I think the trustees of Catholic schools, supported by CCMS, in terms of actual implementation, have demonstrated an openness to the creative spectrum of possibilities for sharing, from shared campuses to shared enterprise to all sorts of arrangements within that. Depending on which particular calibration you're referring to, all of those kinds of issues can be worked out at the local level. And as I say, it's not reinventing a wheel in terms of concept. This already happens in Great Britain. Okay, we share. But the critical thing is, it's, as others have pointed out, it's a shared Christian school that we would be talking about. So in relation then to how the RE certificate issue would apply within that, and the reason it applies at all is that we argue it is perfectly legitimate for parents who wish to choose a Catholic school to expect that the teachers in that school have a professional and verifiable professional competence to support that ethos. The mechanism that we generally use to do that, and which we would argue fits under the concept in European law of genuine occupational requirement exceptions for teachers and so on in schools, is the RE certificate. In Catholic primary schools, every primary school teacher is an RE teacher, because RE is taught by that one individual teacher in the curriculum, so they all have to do that. So but they don't have to be a Catholic to have achieved the verifiable professional competence that the trustees apply in terms of having an RE certificate. So the real issue is accessibility to the certificate, not the denominational adherence of the person who has it. But we would argue that across the spectrum of possibilities, that parents have a right to expect that there's some verifiable professional level of competence in supporting the ethos or the presentation of the Catholic aspect of the school and the curriculum. Does that make sense? Or have I confused it even further?
It's an interesting answer, because you know, I do see that as a practical obstacle in the way of actually reaching an actual shared school where you've both controlled and maintained in the same classroom. I don't know how you deal with that.
Sorry, just to be technically correct, we wouldn't be talking about controlled and maintained in the same classroom. We'd be talking about a jointly owned and a jointly managed Christian school. This is a new model that doesn't fit. It would actually be a maintained, as Jim explained earlier, it would be a maintained, not a Catholic maintained, but the legal model would be a maintained school, not a controlled school. So it wouldn't be a state school, it would be in the ownership of the churches collectively in some agreed way. Do you understand? In other words, it's not a mixture. It would be certainly a school that would be owned by the spectrum of Christian churches, the transferors and the Catholic trustees together. And the discussions with the department have been precisely about that. How could that be constituted in terms of the representation on the Board of Trustees? But we're not reinventing a wheel in terms of implementation in the school environment, because there are examples in Britain. And that's part of our commitment to the concept of sharing.
Shared education. So there is some tentative talks going on about how you deal
it's
with those
more than
issues.
tentative. It's actually formal talks with the
Formal
department,
talks?
yes, about how that could actually be done, yes.
That's reasonable.
And we're committed to the concept, yes.
The other issue which puzzles me, because I'm no theologian, but I don't know where you get into theology of academic selection not being acceptable. Has the Church some sort of theology which says that it's
Yes.
not acceptable?
Yes.
And what are the grounds for that? Because my experience is all schools use academic selection. It doesn't matter where it calls itself, an ability school or a grammar school. They all do it.
Well, let's be clear, there's no doctrine in the Catholic Church about academic selection or not. However, what is fundamental to the established and verifiable in writing social doctrine of the Catholic Church is that it is part of being Catholic that you have, in imitation of Jesus Christ, a particular commitment to and concern for everyone equally, and that you have a particular concern for those who are most vulnerable and marginalised and poor. I mentioned that before you come in, actually, in my opening presentation. So that is part of Catholic theology, what is sometimes called the preferential option for the poor. It is our judgment that academic selection militates particularly against that principle and is therefore inconsistent with the ethos of a Catholic school. But that is balanced with the difficult issue of parental choice even in this area. And that's where we're probably all struggling. And if I can just go back to Pat's earlier question about what is frustration with the Catholic Church or leadership, I would argue, why is he expecting a higher level of leadership? We've actually achieved more on the ground than his own party and minister have done. And why are you applying a higher level on this in terms of our leadership as a church than you failed to get agreement here in this chamber about this issue? We are trying to get agreement within a spectrum of views that exists within the Catholic school community, and we're committed to trying to do that. But what motivates it is this fundamental concern for the principle that every child should be given the same opportunity to the same level of resources and commitment to education in our schools, in a common curriculum that now exists.
Could I just add something to that? I think your point, Jonathan, about there's selection everywhere. There is differentiation throughout our system, but that doesn't require people to go to different buildings, particularly when you've got a common curriculum, to be differentiated. What we need in our schools is a sufficiently large enrolment in order to offer a range of choice that will meet the needs of all young people. And I could be very good at, well, I was a teacher of English, so one would expect that I should be reasonably good at English, but might not be so good at maths. I could very easily at a school be in the top band, the top set for one subject, and the lowest set for another. Larger schools give you the flexibility to structure according to differentiation, but that differentiation is not absolute. It's not saying for everything you are in the top band and for everything you, person B, are in the bottom band. We have to reflect the fact that we've all got different strengths, and one of the things that education does is to develop those strengths. There was a phrase which I've used before this committee in the past, which came from the Marmot report on health, where he talked about a universal entitlement, but access was proportionate to capability to access that service by oneself, or support needed to access that service. And the concept of proportionate universalism, I think, is very important here in education, particularly from a Catholic perspective, in that those who have greater obstacles, if you like, need additional support in order that ultimately, hopefully, they will achieve the outcome. Now, selection does not facilitate that. But the point that I made earlier, I think selection inhibits even those who are selected, because that option of understanding wider society, that option to access a wider range of curricular choice and indeed respond to their particular learning needs and motivation, I think is easier if you've got that access. And I would much prefer that we get away from this philosophical discussion about selection and ask the question, how can we best prepare all of our young people to be contributors to the economy and the society in which we live? And I think the Catholic view on education has come to understand that and promote that in a way which possibly it didn't do in responding back in 1947 to the introduction of the three-tier system as it was at that particular time. Society has moved on, our understanding has moved on, but unfortunately the legislation that goes back in various forms to that time is still pretty much in place. And that's why I think you as politicians have a responsibility to ask the question of what is the role of education in the big picture. I actually believe it's at the centre of the development of this society and economy.
That's a fascinating answer from both of you, because you do actually believe there's an ethos there, an ethical issue around all of this.
Yes.
I find that fascinating because, from my religious background, we don't see any ethical argument in there on it at all. That's fascinating. Is the simple truth out there not the actual fact that parents have voted with their feet, despite what you actually believe?
A parent will make the best choices they see it for their child from what is available. What we're saying is, on the basis of parental choice, everyone should have the same choice. What we have at this moment is a system where not everyone has the same choice. That's the equality argument. But we believe that once that choice has been made, that it's the responsibility of the school chosen to ensure that that young person has access to all the support that they need to benefit fully from the educational choices that they make.
Jim, if I get you right, you're on the same path as myself. All schools should be equally good.
Yes,
that's
means
the critical thing.
The fundamental problem with that is we need to be honest with ourselves, and I'm honest with myself about this. All schools are not equal. They're not equally good.
That's correct.
And I will pay one tribute. I think you have worked very hard on trying to rectify that issue. Something that's been missing in the control sector, and hopefully now will be rectified. But is that not the ultimate solution? Because parents make the ultimate decision on where their child goes.
We have to, we're facing significant financial difficulties in our schools, but one of the things that I'll be saying to our principals is we're still about raising standards. We cannot give up on the raising standards, and everyone is entitled to that education. And the point, I agree with you that what we should be doing is ensuring that all of our schools are as good as they can be. And this is the encouragement, if you like, to the control sector. When CCMS came into being, we were behind every other sector in outcomes for young people, in terms of our employment practices, in terms of our buildings. We have caught up significantly and gone ahead in some areas. So, everybody can achieve this, but we need to look at the tools that need to be put in place to ensure that.
Chair, could I just take the opportunity to say that the Catholic trustees are as concerned about the underachievement of young Protestant males as we are about our own school system, and we have said to the control sector and indeed to the transfer hours and so on, we are there. There should be more. This should be part of the sharing. Should be helping each other to ensure we achieve this ideal of every school a good school, an excellent school. However, there is on the selection issue. There's no shortage of evidence, and I'm sure we don't have time to go into it. It might be a different committee hearing to go into that shows that academic selection actually doesn't provide in pure, whatever about the ethical issue that we believe is there, but in pure pedagogical, educational terms, is not necessarily the best way to provide
in our type of environment for the spectrum of children's abilities and needs in terms of achievement. And also the idea that you just define educational achievement on some narrow academic base when we have a common curriculum now and a common curriculum duty on all of our schools at post-primary level. So this is a wider and a more complicated subject, but insofar as that gets us through the initial question you asked, that's where we're coming from. But the commitment that every school in our society would be a good school and that the sectors should be cooperating to achieve that goal. Yeah.
Thank you. We've deviated somewhat from the inquiry at this stage. Mr. Lunn.
Well, thanks for... I don't normally get back in, you know.
Round two.
So good the last time.
Oh, thank you. First, can I just mention about you mentioned the G8 situation?
Yes.
As far as I understand it, the President of the United States wanted to visit a Northern Ireland school.
He's only one of many examples of this, by the way.
And he wanted also to visit an integrated school because of his open advocacy for that principle of children being educated together. So that's why he went to Enniskillen and integrated. He also mentioned, he used the term almost in the same breath, but anti-Catholicism. I can only tell you that as far as I'm concerned, there is no anti-Catholicism involved here. I may well be anti some of the attitudes that you take in terms of the protection of your school system, but that is not an attack on your faith in any way. But I want to ask you a question, just first of all, and this is really it, because your paper indicates that you'd like to see the protection for integrated schools removed, the facilitation and encouragement protection. Now,
the duty to favour, not to protect the rights.
You'd like to see the duty removed. That duty is only really applicable in terms of the setting up of a new integrated school, where they're, as with Irish Medium, where they're allowed certain licence in terms of setting up a very small school. They still have to prove themselves over 3 years, and in the long term, if an integrated school is not viable because of the various criteria that are laid down, it's subject to the same pressures as any other school. So it seems to me that the people often talk about this level of protection or superiority that integrated schools have, but in fact they don't. They don't have any more protection than your sector has, and frankly, in your organisation, Jim.
No, Trevor, I think
he actually said that the Moy situation couldn't have gone ahead without the agreement of CCMS. I'd like to see nice you've been able to take the similar.
You're using a word that isn't in the legislation, though, Trevor. That's protection is not the issue.
In terms of shared education, there had to be a lead body, and that lead body had to be CCMS and or the Education Library Board. That was part of the regulation around the shared education. So that was just the way it was. In order for that to be taken forward, CCMS and the local Education Library Board had to promote it or support it.
I think, sorry,
go ahead,
one of the things that is important here is that we acknowledge absolutely, and I restate what I said at the very start, the rights of the integrated sector to exist, but we equally believe that our rights to exist, and indeed other sectors, need to be recognised. And some of the things which are said are about almost everybody else promoting integrated schools. If you look back to the history of the integrated movement, it was a ground-up initiative. And what we've said is that to achieve that spectrum, no matter how far along the track we get, it still requires a ground-up. And, I mean, the integrated sector still have the facility and the capacity to grow from the ground up. But what we're saying is that we equally have the right to exist. And it's not a case of one or the other. I think it's a case of everybody having a space and respecting that space.
Couldn't agree more.
Yes, two things. Just on the issue of anti-Catholicism, I made that comment in the context of somebody asking me about secularism, a secular trend in education generally. And I made the point that sometimes it can be a mask actually for a subtle form of anti-faith and sometimes particularly even an anti-Catholicism specifically.
I made no claim and I was very careful to point out that that is not representative of the general sweep, or indeed particularly necessarily of integrated schools. But it's part of the wider argument you sometimes get this, and I have experienced that. I have experienced that very clearly, consistently and directly, so I don't resile from the fundamental claim I'm making. However, on the specific point about the legislation, what we suggest is if there's going to be a legislative duty on the department, that it should be precisely to sharing. Now, we've said it may not be the best thing to put it in legislation, but it should be, if it's going to be there, to sharing rather than a narrow form of the spectrum of possibilities that work and have some verifiable impact in terms of this objective. What you have at the moment is bizarre situations arising, where CCMS is being asked, for example, at the moment, how it intends to promote integrated education, which completely ignores the fact they're not there to promote any sector, But so you get these kind of bizarre things happening. And also it helps to build this culture that some are more equal than others, and in terms of education provision by the department. We fully support the idea that any sector that is embryonic needs to be supported and encouraged and facilitated, and there needs to be honest ways of trying to establish parental views and so on in that context. So we support that. But we're just saying at this point we would challenge the idea that duty should still exist.
Yes, I frankly can't see the difference. I mean, the obligation to facilitate and encourage is
integrated education.
Entirely subject to parental choice. It requires the parents of an existing school to make a decision, or a group of parents who actually act quite bravely at times to decide to try and set up a new integrated school, and there's been precious few of them in recent years.
But is it not the case that the integrated education movement is claiming the department is failing in its duty precisely on the basis of that?
Absolutely, the department, there's been many instances where the department...
So they would prefer to see a more aggressive...
The purpose of having the integrated sector is that sector should be creating the conditions, not the department or CCMS or anybody else. And we are absolutely committed to ensuring that they have the right to do that. But it shouldn't necessarily be at the expense of someone else giving up their school. I think what we're saying is that if there is, and I mean, NICE have a much greater facility in this than we have, to encourage people to want to have an integrated school in the community and to move that forward. They're entitled to do that. But as Tim has pointed out, if we interpret Judge Tracy's ruling in a particular way, CCMS and indeed the boards have an obligation now to promote integrated schools when we don't have an obligation to promote our own schools. We can advocate for them, but not promote them.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. I'm perhaps more anxious about you having to leave on time than maybe you were. But thank you very much. I think members find that to be a particularly interesting session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Can I just leave here so if anyone wants a copy?
Moving swiftly.
Okay. Moving then to moving backwards into our agenda again. Apologies. I received an apology from Mr. Hazard for the members who are in attendance. Moving then to chairperson's business. Just before the start of today's business, I received a copy of a petition from the Parents Education as Autism Therapist, PEAT. Over 2,700 people have signed this petition asking that parents and carers of children and young people with autism in Northern Ireland should be given the chance to choose effective ABA-based intervention if they wish. If members are content that we forward this to the Department of Education and also to Health.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Also refer you to tabled items in relation to teaching and non-teaching redundancy. This includes a letter from DE on the redundancies package for teachers up to 60 weeks and the terms and conditions, genuine redundancy and schools in difficult financial positions. In written answers, DE has indicated that the non-teaching redundancy package will be 1 month per year up to 24 months. Just be useful if we perhaps contacted DE just asking for the anticipated overall costs of teaching and non-teaching redundancy. Members are content that we do that.
Can we ask them to make sure that they work the redundancies through in a more efficient way than last year? I mean, I think
that they've attempted to do that, obviously, with what they've set out, but I don't think that can ever be overemphasised enough.
I know.
And also members, I'm sure, will, like myself, have received a number of correspondence from in relation to the primary language programme. I think those involved believe it to be a hasty decision, and they've sent through figures where they say the programme's £900,000, 40,000 pupils per week have access to it, and it's working out at 7 pence per pupil per week. We have written to the department with regards to this programme. As yet we haven't received any response, so it might be useful for us just to highlight that again to them. Thank you very much. Moving then to draft minutes of our meeting of the 11th of March. If members are content, they are complete and accurate reporting of those proceedings. Yes. Thank you very much. Matters arising, just refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 33. There's also a paper provided by the Assembly Research on young people's views on sharing and integration in education. So if you're content that we note those papers, I just add them to our webpage. Move then to our next presentation. Northern Ireland Teachers Pension Scheme, secondary legislation, with a briefing from DE. Just refer you again to clerk's cover note at page 64 and to the SR 126/2015, the Teacher Pensions Miscellaneous Amendments Regulation Northern Ireland 2015. And we'll welcome Seamus Gallagher, Head of Pensions Policy Team, to our committee. Thank you very much once again, Seamus. You're a regular attender.
Yes, more regular than I would like.
Well, you're very welcome all the same. If you'd like to make an opening statement, then members will follow some questions where necessary.
Thank you, Chair, and members, for inviting me back again to talk about pensions legislation. We're talking today about the miscellaneous amendment regulations. Briefed you on the 4th of March, I believe, on these ones. We made the regulations on the 6th of March, and we're now in the statutory period. Nothing has really changed since I came along the last time. These regulations really put the finishing touches to pension reform. They implement the new employer's contribution rate and the cost cap, and tidy up some earlier errors in the regulations. The statutory examiner has made a comment on these regulations, and we've gone back accepting the comments that he's made. So we will amend these regulations again at the next time we are changing, not in the near future. The regulations commented on won't have any effect for at least 4 years. So other than that, I really don't have anything more to tell you.
So it'll be changed after the 4-year period?
They'll be changed the next time there's an opportunity when I'm making regulations. It's just a couple of minor amendments that the statutory examiner has suggested. He is saying that we should have referred to a DFP regulation rather than a direction in relation to the cost cap, the 2%. That it can be exceeded by, but that cost cap won't be exceeded until before the next valuation, which won't be until around about 4 years' time. And the other ones are he's just saying are really printing errors. He's saying, well, you can insert a header here and stuff. They're minor. There's nothing in it. So we will amend those regulations the next time we're amending the regulations for something substantive.
Okay, so there's no implications on what you're proposing at this stage.
Yeah.
Mr. Lunn?
I know we're at the point of just accepting all this, Seamus, but it still concerns me that, as I said in the House the other day, on a different set of regulations, I do get confused with some of these different sets, that individual teachers are paying more and their employers are contributing less than in other schemes within public civil service. And I mean, I'm looking here at the clerk's note today, which indicates that the ELBs are paying around 20% to their non-teaching employees' NILGOS pensions, whereas in the case of the teachers, it's eventually going to be around 13.2 with a wee bit of room for manoeuvre. Are the benefits so much better?
The benefits
the teacher scheme, or are they just comparable to what these other schemes provide?
The benefits are comparable amongst all the public sector schemes except for the uniform type schemes like fire and police, so that they're comparable. Now, the employer contribution is 17.7%. 13.2% is probably not likely to kick in for many, many years. Once there are no people left in the existing final salary scheme, that would be the cap. The differences in member and employer contributions between the teachers, and health, and the local government schemes are all historic, in that there's been different rates of pay for those categories of people, and the value of the pension has featured differently in terms of pay negotiations over many, many years. And at this stage, in the Hutton report, he ruled out any kind of realignment as being practical, or because those differences are historical. But the overall contribution into those schemes, when you combine member and employer contributions, is fairly consistent, and that's why the benefits coming out are consistent.
Yeah, this extra contribution up to 17.7 on behalf of the employer, how is that going to be funded after the end of the 4-year period?
After the end of the 4-year period, the actuary will produce a new valuation which will set the new contribution rate, which will, I don't know what it will be, but I expect it should come down from the 17.7%, as at that stage we'll have 4 years worth of people in the career average scheme, which ultimately would reduce employers' contributions.
And is it, Chairman, I know I've rehearsed some of this before, but if a young teacher coming into the profession now does 40 years service, pays 40 years contributions, and still hasn't reached the age which at that time will probably be 68 for his pension to kick in, is it reasonable that his pension should be actuarially reduced for the number of years, perhaps between the age 63 and age 68, that he has chosen not to work?
That is overriding legislation in the Pensions Act, which leaves the teacher scheme no choice about the retirement age. So the pension would be reduced if they took it early, but there will be options to offset some of that reduction.
Does the same apply to the other public service pensions?
Yes, the same applies to all of the public sector schemes. The pension age is set as equal to state pension age, except for fire, where there was a special dispensation.
And are the other public service one, are they funded or unfunded?
NILGOS is the only one that's funded. The others are all unfunded.
So in the case of NILGOS, market performance, fund performance might come into play, whereas on this particular scheme it doesn't.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just to remind members that we didn't have any objection to this draft rule on the 3rd of March. Are members still content? Okay, thank you very much. So the Committee for Education has considered the statutory rule SR 126/2015, Teachers' Pensions, Miscellaneous Amendments, Regulations, Northern Ireland 2015, and subject to the report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules, has no objection to the rule. Content? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Seamus.
Thanks for your time.
Moving then to our next briefing from DE, GTCNI secondary legislation, teacher eligibility. Just refer you to Clerk's cover note at page 95 and to SR 151 2015, the General Teaching Council for Northern Ireland Registration of Teachers Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2015. Just welcome the following departmental witnesses. We have Miriam Skelly, Head of Teacher Education Team, and Sam Dempster, Teacher Education Team. Both very welcome. If you'd like to make a statement, the members will follow up with some questions if they feel they need to.
Great. Good afternoon, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee. I'll keep the opening remarks short because I appreciate members might have questions. As you know, we briefed the committee in July 2014 about the repeal of the Department's power in Article 70 of the Education and Libraries Northern Ireland Order 1986 and the resultant gap in the regulation of the teaching profession. We explained that the powers have been repealed enable the Department to make regulations related to the consideration and potential removal of a person's eligibility to teach on the grounds of misconduct. Since the repeal in 2009, the regulations had not had any legal effect. It was always the Department's intention to repeal Article 70, but to do so once the General Teaching Council had assumed responsibility for the regulation of teachers. However, when the repeal happened in 2009, its consequences were not adequately assessed in the Department, and officials continued to rely upon the repealed regulations when considering individual cases of teacher eligibility. To address the gap, we have used the powers in the Education Northern Ireland Order 1998 to make regulations to put in place procedures to enable the General Teaching Council to perform a limited regulatory role. At that meeting in July, the committee deferred a decision on the proposal but subsequently approved them after representation from the General Teaching Council in September last year. You recall from our previous briefing that these regulations are in addition to Safeguarding of Vulnerable Groups Northern Ireland Order 2007, which covers child protection issues. In addition, employers have powers of dismissal to deal with teachers found guilty of misconduct. The amending regulations were made and led on the 11th of March and will come into operation on the 1st of April. In brief, they enable the GTC to remove a teacher from the register if found guilty of misconduct, provide for the individuals to make representations to the GTC in their defence, require the GTC to issue a notice of its decision, and provide for a right of appeal to the High Court against any decision. They also enable the GTC to make operational and procedural rules to support the legislative changes. In developing the amending regulations, we were mindful of the need to give GTC sufficient time to develop and agree the processes and procedures around hearings and to train panel members. GTC was consulted throughout the process and provided with drafts of the regulations, and upon their request we agreed an implementation date of the 1st of April 2015. The Department took forward the amending regulations as soon as we could, but in addition to the substantive provisions relating to the removal from the register, we identified a number of other provisions in the main registration regulations which needed to be updated to reflect changes to legislation and regulatory regime in other jurisdictions. In particular, Regulation 3 is designed to prevent a person who is barred from working as a teacher in England, Scotland or Wales from registering as a teacher here. It lists references to legislation relating to these powers available to equivalent teaching councils to make disciplinary orders in their respective jurisdictions. In recent years, there have been significant changes to legislation covering this in England, Scotland and Wales, which impacted upon the amending regulations. Identifying and getting the information relating to these changes required liaison with a number of departments in England and Wales, which took longer than we would have liked. It was made more complex because of the interaction between education legislation and wider safeguarding law. This has created the delay in finalising these regulations. However, it's important that the registration regulations reflect these changes. Not doing so would carry the risk that a person barred from teaching in another jurisdiction could apply to be registered as a teacher here. Although it took time to get them right, the changes we have made provide a more robust regulatory safeguard. Thank you, Chair. We're happy to take the questions.
Thank you very much. The committee had anticipated receiving a bill. The fact that we have an SR, does that mean that we're not likely to receive a bill in this mandate?
Well, the DE has 4 bills that it's hoped to get through in this mandate. The GTCNI bill, the Special Educational Needs one, which I think is with you at the moment, anti-bullying and shared education. we realise because of the timescales there's a bit of a danger that they might not all get through, and the Minister's considering the timescales, but we have been working on the GTC-NI bill.
So the fact that we're receiving an SR here today doesn't reflect the fact that we may
No,
not see a bill
two are
before
separate.
the end of the mandate?
Yeah, this is to do with a repeal that happened in 2009, where the department would have had limited powers to teachers' eligibility if they had been found guilty of misconduct after they'd been dismissed by their employer. The GTC-NI bill that we're working on would give GTC much wider powers to take action short of moving somebody from the register. So this regulation is only about whether you remove them or you don't remove them, whereas the bill would be about, there would be other things like maybe putting a condition to receive additional training or
suspend them from the register for a short period of time. The other thing I should say is it'll take a wee while to enact all the provisions in the bill, even if it gets through in the mandate. So it might be 2 or 3 years down the line before they have their full regulatory powers. So these regulations are in place in the meantime.
So this is just an interim action?
Yes.
No, that's fine. Can you give us assurance that GCC will be able to fulfil all the additional duties that you're anticipating that they should be looking at with regards to this?
The GTC came in September and themselves said that they welcomed taking on this regulatory role and that they were confident of their ability to deliver on it. They then asked us for a 1st of April implementation date to give them time to prepare for it. And our recent discussions with GTC are that they're taking steps forward to get their rules and processes developed and their panel members trained. In order to develop their rules, they need the legislative cover that this regulation provides for them.
But you're confident that they'll be able to fulfil the duties from the 1st of April?
Yes, I mean, they've engaged their own legal advisor in developing their rules and processes, so everything should be in place, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Craig?
Yeah. Thank you. Miriam, did I pick you up right? Someone who's struck off in any other part of the United Kingdom could actually register here?
No, they can't register here. We were trying to explain why there was a delay. When we came last July, we wanted to delay these regulations as soon as possible to plug the gap. But it took us longer than we expected because when we went to the other jurisdictions, their legislation had changed and it was quite complicated. So we now are confident that they won't be able to register here.
Right, so it was just plugging a change in legislation, so that never actually...
What we were doing was trying to update the legislation. There are a number of references in our regulations which prevent a teacher from working here if they're barred elsewhere. That piece of legislation was essentially out of date, so we needed to update it.
Right, so without this it could happen?
Yes.
So we need to implement this?
Yeah.
And I take it the other one, I take it there is difficulties in striking someone off the register here, even if they are found guilty of something serious, or what's this other part of the regulation about?
Well, if it's this is an additional safeguard. So if it's about a child protection issue, the Safeguarding Vulnerable Persons Act comes into play, and they may be barred from working with children. So taking them off the register would have no additional practical effect in that way because they can't work with children. Employers also would deal with if misconduct come up which wasn't a danger to children. Employers have their own right to move towards dismissal, so the person would be dismissed from that post. This is about their actual working as a teacher rather than a particular teaching job, I suppose is the way that we would put it.
So an employer might be able to dismiss them from their post at any particular school. This would be about removing them from the profession, so they can't work in any school.
Right, and can that not be done at present?
No.
No.
No?
That's what we're moving to do now.
Right. Speaks for itself.
Can I just ask how many teachers were deregistered without the proper powers?
There were 10 cases where the department had actually removed eligibility to teach, but the vast majority of those cases were actually child protection issues, so they had been dealt with under the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups legislation anyway and been barred from working with children. In the other cases, there would have been no danger to children.
And are there cases which are being challenged?
No, we've advised the people involved of what has happened. We've actually written out to them and told them what had happened and that we didn't have the power, and we haven't had any further feedback on that.
And is there an estimated cost?
We had one at one stage,
Well, it
didn't
would depend on an individual case, because an individual might sue the department for loss of earnings, for instance. So it would depend how the court would look at that. So a typical case might be 45 to 50,000, but that's an estimate.
Okay, so there's no definitive cost.
Because it will depend on the in the individual cases, but we haven't had any challenge.
Haven't had a challenge.
Yeah.
Well, Chair, I wanted to ask the officials a question which is about GTCNI, but not directly about this particular subject, only if you're finished with this. Yeah. We get figures from the department about the number of teachers who have managed to find employment year on year. I think the last figure we got was about 18%. And that appears, it seems to me, the only reliable source of that information is the number of teachers who register with the GTCNI. So what I'm curious about is this, and I mean, you come back to us, or I can ask it in the form of a written question. I take it the figures we get only refer to those who find employment within Northern Ireland. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, what proportion of them are full-time or part-time, and how do you define part-time? And finally, what are those who have found employment on a temporary basis under the signature scheme included in the figures for those who have found employment? That's it.
I think we'd have to take that back, because it would depend what figures were provided at the time.
Yeah.
We would have to look at
What GTC record is permanent posts and significant temporary posts, which is a term or more. So if you're on the register and in employment, as they have it, you have an open job record, it's a permanent post or a significant temporary post.
Yeah. I take it that the figures would relate to, it is the GTCNI, so the figures
And they are, yes,
they're Northern Ireland.
They're jobs
Yes,
in
they
Northern
are.
Ireland, they don't record.
Yeah. And what about the signature project, Dan, would you know?
They would have been included, yes.
Included. Actually makes the situation worse.
Well,
That's fine. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Members, have you any other questions? Are we content?
Yep.
Okay. So if there's consensus that the Committee for Education has considered the Statutory Rule SR 151/2015, the General Teaching Council for Northern Ireland Registration of Teachers Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2015, and subject to the report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules, has no objection to the rule. Members content?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Moving then to our final briefing. Shared and Integrated Education Inquiry. We have Brookport Primary School and St Mary's Primary School. Just referring to the Clerk's cover note at page 141, and to the submission to the inquiry from Brookport Shared Education Partnership, and also information from the Department on the Shared Campus Programme. Okay, well, we have Hazel Gardner, Principal at Brookport Primary School, Dermot Finlay, Principal of St Mary's Primary School, Brookport, Aris Barker, the Western Education and Library Board, and Mary Hampsey, Council for Catholic Maintained Schools. Good afternoon, you're all very welcome, and can I first of all apologise for the delay. I know that you were in the gallery, so you were able to hear some of what was being said, and they obviously might be informative to yourself as well, so thank you very much for waiting. Can I ask you to make your opening statement, and members will follow up with some questions.
Good morning, Chair, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to brief you this morning on our shared education programme. I'm Hazel Gardner, the Principal of the Control School, and I'm going to talk about our school experiences of shared education to date, and then my colleague Dermot Finlay, the Principal of St Mary's, will tell you about our current programmes of shared education and our plans for the future. Our two schools, which are situated in the village of Brookborough, serve the surrounding rural area. Brookborough is in the most deprived 6% of super output areas in relation to proximity to services. The schools are just a short walk apart, less than 10 minutes. Our current enrolment is 119 pupils, 66 in the Control School and 53 in St Mary's. And each school has 3 teachers, including ourselves. Our schools reflect the community in which we serve, with over 1/3 of the pupils qualifying for free school meals and St Mary's receiving extended schools funding. The two schools have enjoyed excellent relationships for over 40 years, which takes us back to the 1970s. We've participated in Education for Mutual Understanding, cross-community contact schemes, and also a local cross-border, cross-community scheme with schools in County Sligo called the Riverbrook Project. These projects involve the children working together, although mainly on trips away from the school, but they did include residentials in McGilligan Field Centre and Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, and that was most unusual going back to the 1970s that schools were able to do that. So in a sense, our schools have been working together long before the phrase shared education was coined. All of these activities continued through challenging times. I was a young teacher in the school in the 1987 when the principal of the school at that time lost his mother and father-in-law in the Remembrance Day bomb. So both schools in Brookborough have had parents, pupils and children who have suffered and been personally affected. And even since then, when politically sensitive issues are reported in the media, it has the potential to affect the dynamic of the partnership. But the commitment and the strength of our partnership has enabled us to overcome these challenges. The two schools then maintained and developed their linkages, and today we stand on the threshold of a shared campus for our children and the community. We believe if Brookborough can do this, other divided communities can do this also. In the last 6 years, through funding and support from Fermanagh Trust, the children have enjoyed shared lessons across the curriculum, and that has included joint classes in Respecting Difference, undertaking a major history project where the P6 children from the two schools interviewed local people and looked at little country schools that were closed and actually found out that they were integrated all those years ago. They performed a self-penned drama called Racism Ruins Lives, which they performed for the public, and shared classes in gymnastics, ICT and art, to name a few. One of the differences between the old community relations programmes and the Fermanagh Trust Shared Education is that all children are now spending time on a regular, indeed weekly basis in each other's schools. That's right from P1 to P7, working and playing together, and that has resulted in them being more comfortable in each other's company, appreciative of their cultural differences and personal similarities, and has allowed for friendships to be formed. There are obvious educational benefits from all of this and also societal benefits. But we also want to stress that we feel shared education has not diluted our separate cultures. We both have strong identities. And support from the Ulster Scots Agency has enabled the school I am in to work on the flagship programme, where we celebrate culture through dance, music and drama. In fact, last Friday, Trina Somerville, the Director of Education and Language at the Ulster Scots Agency, attended a performance of Dan Gordon's play The Boat Factory in the school. St Mary's also has a strong cultural identity, which is celebrated through sport, music and language. Through shared education, we also learn about each other's cultures and have shared performances and activities. For example, as recently as yesterday, our schools were involved in Project St Patrick in Enniskillen, and over the last few years we have entered choral speaking as a joint entry in the Fermanagh Feis, and on one occasion we won. The children have played rugby together, and at one of those Project St Patrick parades in Enniskillen they actually performed Scottish and Irish dancing at the same time. For our teachers, we have hosted joint training, and through the Fermanagh Trust programme again, there has been training in good practice, partnership building, the Respecting Difference programme. The teachers plan together, which is particularly useful in small schools, where it is possible to feel quite isolated at times. We have organised our staff through shared education, and that has allowed us to decomposite combined year groups, again with obvious educational benefits for the children, so that each school now has the access to the skills of 6 teachers, and in the autumn term our P3 children from the 2 schools were brought together to be taught science by one of my teachers who is doing an Enthuse award at the minute and has a particular interest in science, so that is making use of her skill. We organise joint training and workshops for parents in, for example, internet safety by the PSNI, the Respecting Difference programme and reading strategies. And although we have separate parent-teacher associations, they have come together and worked, most recently bringing the parents, grandparents and children together in the village to plant bulbs to improve the environment. Our 2 boards of governors have had several joint meetings, which really began back with the first area plans, and then they formed a joint subcommittee which has met several times, and the Western Education Board and CCMS have joined that subcommittee and attended several meetings as we prepared to submit an application for the shared campus. I'm now going to hand over to Dermot, who's going to tell you a little bit about the current plans and for the future.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come up and talk to you. I've had the pleasure of meeting some of you on previous visits to Stormont and indeed down in Fermanagh at Enniskillen when you visited. The committee will be aware that the WLB and CCMS have submitted a proposal to the Department of Education for a shared campus in Brookborough. Providing more detail on the level of sharing that we're doing, the following table that's in your copy provides an illustration of the sharing at pupil and teacher level, which we've planned through the Shared Education Signature Project, and we've applied for that just recently. It can be seen that 100% of our children take part in shared activities, providing regular and sustained contact. Through the 3-year Signature Project for Shared Education, we plan to deliver shared activities and to decomposite combined year groups, both of which we have will have huge educational benefits for the children. We're also sharing a teacher within this project, and the value of our shared education was actually acknowledged by ETI in our recent inspections of 2011 and 2013, where they said the children spoke enthusiastically about their experiences, and there are many examples within the school of very good collaborative work in shared education. The synergy of sharing not only complements the joint learning and teaching, but it also raises the individual provision of each school. The richness of our shared past and the proposal of a shared campus has developed naturally over the years due to the high level of sharing that Hazel has talked about between the 2 schools over 4 decades. The Brookborough Shared Campus has an immense potential to enhance and develop a shared future for the local community. The proposal for the shared campus was a community-based decision to sustain primary education in Brookborough for both sections of the community. It is, as the Minister of Education has asked for, a bottom-up local solution which meets local needs. A series of meetings were held with parents and governors, initially separately and then jointly. The Fermanagh Trust has facilitated a community survey in March 2014, which was distributed to parents, staff, churches and members of the wider community, and the outcome was overwhelming. 93%, in fact, of the community supported the shared campus. The campus has the support of all political parties in Fermanagh District Council, and at a recent meeting in February 2015 this year with the First and Deputy First Ministers and Arlene Foster, we received a tremendously positive and enthusiastic response for our proposal for the shared campus. The Deputy First Minister, indeed during question time in the Assembly at the start of March, described the Brookborough initiative and our leadership as inspirational. We believe that the sharing that we are currently involved in will widen and deepen within the shared campus. Shared campuses are about building united communities, and that is what we want to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to meet with us this afternoon. Just really for the record, could you maybe just explain what the shared campus will look like and the practicalities that will be involved within that?
If I had a fantastic diagram, I could show you exactly what it looked like. But the concept is that Hazel and our 2 schools will be on the one site within the one building. That's quite an important factor. We're not suggesting 2 new schools. We're suggesting one build where...
Just to cut across you, does that mean that you'll have a project similar to the Moy?
Yes.
Similar, yes. Yeah. So one building on a shared campus site with classrooms that my school will occupy, classrooms that Hazel will occupy, 2 distinct schools, St Mary's, Brookborough and Brookborough controlled. And we would also have then parts of the building that we would share, including the playground, the lunch hall. We'd have a classroom where shared activities can take place.
You'll no doubt be aware of some of the criticism that the Moy project has received. How would you view that?
Which criticism are you thinking of?
Well, there's a variety of criticisms in relation to the fact that you have two sets of children going through the front door and then being separated.
Yeah, well, when I first heard about the Moy on the media, which I'm sure you've all been subjected to at some point, I thought it was a strange design and pattern as well. We visited some schools in Glasgow which had the shared campus model, and actually once I saw that in practice, it actually became clear to me that it was quite a reality. If you're talking the depiction of left and right and blue and green as you see on the television, I actually think that's oversimplified. I think it's naive. I think it's understating the whole case. And if I just draw on an example of my own school, the children in the playground in my school, P4 and 5 come and line up, P6 and 7 come and line up. They go left and they go right into their classrooms. Some mornings, depending on the activities, the P4 go off to the left, and P5, 6 and 7 go off to the right with me. The primary 1, 2 and 3 are in a totally different part of the school. Now, you know, that's not divisive, that's just the natural organisation of any school. In fact, the shared campus that Hazel and I hopefully will succeed in getting increases the contact that the children have, because they're in the playground in the morning, they're having lunch together, they're having planned curricular activities, so in actual fact they see much more of each other. I've worked in a large school in England where for 500 pupils, they lined up and went through many, many doors, but they were still all part of the same school. So I think the depiction of children sort of lining up and going off here and going off there is naive and oversimplified.
Can I just sort of talk from a sort of a wider community perspective and how that has been received within Brookborough and beyond?
The proposal, overwhelming support. I said one time at a public meeting that I didn't want to take St Mary's Brookborough in a direction and look over my shoulder and find there was nobody else behind me. In actual fact, we're responding to the community, and we said that to Minister O'Dowd, that the people in Brookborough were asked would they consider a shared campus for the sustainability of education in the area, and they've said yes, overwhelmingly.
And we did present various options to the parents way back at the beginning of area planning. We looked at integrated, we looked at the shared, we talked about all the different possibilities, and this is what the parents felt, as Dermot says, is the way forward in our area.
Hazel and I commented as well, the length of the sharing that has been happening in Brookborough is unique compared to other areas of the country. So this didn't happen overnight. You know, I've been in Brookborough 11 years, Hazel's been there a bit longer. Mm-hmm. And we've got to know each other and work with each other and are comfortable in each other's company, and therefore so too are our staff and our parents. I see Hazel's children on a regular basis. She's up in my school as well. So it's been a long time coming, and it's been a sort of organic process, shall I use that term?
I think you have to be commended for the work that you've been doing, and obviously that is a reflection. Those of us who don't represent areas such as yours probably don't understand the difficulties that there are, particularly in border areas, and I do think that you have to be congratulated for that.
Well, I'm a blow-in, you see. I grew up in West Belfast, so for me, being from Fermanagh was an education in itself. So, you know, as Hazel commented at the start of hers, you know, different parts of the country were affected by the Troubles in different ways, and if you tended to live in Belfast or Derry, you thought it was just happening there. When I moved to Fermanagh, I realised there were situations in Fermanagh, people were touched by the Troubles there as well. But 40 years is a long time, and things have moved on. Change does come, it comes slowly, but we've reached, the people of Brookborough have, you know, they're on the threshold here where they're asking the government to consider a shared campus for the community.
So I think the community see huge benefit as well, because currently in Brookborough there is no neutral venue for community events. So to have something like that within the shared campus would be very worthwhile.
Okay, so for you at this stage, the only barrier is a financial barrier with regards to moving forward with this project?
Absolutely. If the Department of Education say yes to us in June, there should be no problem at all. I'm sure they will.
Well, we're hopeful that the outline business case was submitted to the Department of Education at the end of January, 30th of January this year. We expect an outcome from the department before the end of June. We're hoping it'll be a positive result and that we will move to full business case for submission later in the year.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Craig.
Yeah, thank you. Dermot, I listened with interest to what CCMS had to say earlier about their whole concept of shared provision, and I get the impression that we're actually seeing this going to be worked out if everything goes well for you here. But what I struggle with, and I struggle with this because I don't come from a Catholic maintained background, therefore I have no idea what it actually means in reality. The Catholic certificate, it was Tim Bartlett explained it was every teacher is basically an RE teacher, which is a bit of a strange concept coming from my background, but I asked, I suppose, the daft question: can you not actually share classes if you struggle for numbers in a particular class here? You know, which is maybe the next logical progression of this shared model. There was a hint that there's something going on between the churches in the background to get around the Catholic certificate issue. Do you actually foresee that ultimately coming in this model if everything goes well and there's a fair wind?
Well, firstly, as a teacher, I always say there's no such thing as a daft question. Okay, so you said you were asked a daft question. The Catholic teaching certificate is, I understand, is open to everybody. Any teacher, you know, there's a university and teacher training colleges where anyone can access a teacher training certificate for religion, and that means they're competent in teaching Catholic religion. With regards to actually teaching the children in the classes together, we're actually doing that already. Planned delivery of the curriculum. The outline plan that you had in our briefing, we covered things like PDMU, personal development, mutual understanding, which is a key factor in reconciliation and getting children to learn together. We've also extended that out to science and maths. Now, we are and will be two separate schools, and we'll have our own subjects and our own teaching, but planned within that, there will be time with the children. I mean, Hazel's children were up in my school last month, spent a whole day up there being taught together, and they were putting together a DVD for the proposal. So there are times when that can be done, and we've been doing it for a long time. I think that's fair to say that we have been doing it for a long time. The signatory project that we have applied for as well, we have Wednesday mornings, which is given over to shared education, where the two schools come together, and that is across the school. 100% of the children take part in that, and the staff as well. Within the next year or two, we see that extending out to the whole of Wednesday. So in actual fact, the contact is now widening and deepening. When I first met Hazel, we were involved in the EMU, Educational Mutual Understanding. But we met maybe for a day and went off for a trip, and then we came back, and sometimes the children sat in the bus. They sat on that side and we sat on that side, and we got on the bus on the left and the other ones got on the bus on the right, and we had lunch together over there. And there was some degree, and it was well meant and it was well planned out, and the Speedwell Trust did great work with the children. But then they all went back to their own schools. So the contact we have now is intensified, and it's more regular, and again, I think more natural, where the children are actually, they know each other. I make the old joke, and I'll do it again, that when I go into Hazel's school, I make my own coffee or tea. Because we don't stand on ceremony anymore. We know each other quite well, and the children do as well. If I see them around Brookborough, they'll wave over and say, "Hello, Master Finlay." I'm not some sort of person that they don't really know. They've had the contact with me. But in terms of what you're talking about, actually being in the classroom together, we're doing it already, and we intend to increase that.
And I think being able to use expertise of staff is a great thing, to have 6 teachers and their skills. If there's somebody specialising in music or maths or science or whatever, we will be able to tap into that.
So there will be a degree, I suppose the way I look at it is just shared resources. And when I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about teachers here.
Absolutely.
You know, because all of that reduces your overheads.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So you're already there, basically, is what you're telling me, or you're close to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thanks, as I say, a breath of fresh air, and thanks for sharing your journey with us.
Yeah.
I suppose the first thing really is in terms of what is the nursery or preschool provision in the area?
Well, there is a PlayStation in Brookborough. It's called the PlayStation, and it is cross-community. They meet in it's the station house, and it was initiated by the Brookborough Development Association. That's cross-community, and the children are there for a year or two, and then they have been separating.
Yep. Right.
It's a voluntary play group, just
yes,
staff,
yes,
and
yes.
it acts as a feeder to both primary schools at the moment. What we would hope as we go through the process, moving to full business case, we would hope to engage. We've already engaged, and the schools have engaged with the play group, and, with a view to moving the play group to the site as well. The problem is not a problem, but it's just a difference that it's a voluntary playgroup, so the playgroup has to secure funding from alternative sources. But we're happy to engage with a view to including the playgroup in the future on the new site.
The playgroup have wholeheartedly asked could they be part of the campus. We actually have children in our school at the minute who, in fact, Arlene Foster's child was an example. They know each other from playgroup, then they go off to their separate schools, and then they meet up during shared education. Mm-hmm. And actually the shared education project that the Fermanagh Trust funded over the last 6 years was an opportunity for those children to actually sort of reunite friendships, you know, and say, oh, I remember you. So it was a positive thing, and now, according to some of the children in my own class, P7, they're actually now seeing each other outside of school directly as a result of the shared education, because they've got to know each other.
Thanks very much. And if we go back to the beginning of the journey, was it sharing because of the necessity? Did that play a part in, in terms of?
Well, before I actually discovered recently we did a joint play, and we brought in, because Hazel Schools, Brookborough's 50 years old. We're a little bit older, 75, and we were both having celebrations to mark those anniversaries. And we did a play through the shared education, and it was about memories of school. And some of the parents fed in memories. And one of the memories that a parent had was trips to the Causeway Safari Park. Now, I'm just about old enough to remember the Causeway Safari Park. I'm sure some of you are too young. So it was going on then. It was going on even then. And it wasn't out of financial necessity. No. It was out of community relations. Hazel can talk more about that because she was there before I was.
Mm-hmm. The two principals at the time were very committed to it, which was amazing at that time. And as I say, going away on residentials, I accompanied them sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a time, and you could see friendships forming, and that's going back to the 80s, you know.
And one final one, what would you say was your biggest challenge along your journey?
Money. It's always money in terms of the resources, and that's why the Fermanagh Trust, their projects were very invaluable to us because they provided the funding. A lot of what we did, we couldn't have done without that funding. Hazel touched on it about the hearts and minds of people, and when things pop up in the media, and you realise that, you know, sometimes you have to be aware of the sensitivities of the past because they still can come back to haunt us. And every now and again you think, oh, hang on, will what's going on elsewhere, not necessarily in Brookborough, but elsewhere, affect us? And different people are at different levels of that journey of where they're at, and of acceptance as well. I'm not saying it's all been a bed of roses and everyone's sort of flying the flag for shared education, but you know, different people have their different opinions, but wholeheartedly, the people of Brookborough are saying to us, it makes sense because they have a respect, they have a pride in their community, and people have said to me, who's going to want to live in a village with no schools? I've seen tremendous change in Brookborough. I'm only there just over 10 years. They didn't have a pharmacy when I first came. There's been little restaurants and cafes opened up. The pharmacies there now. The 2 schools are an integral part of the village. You know, they're pivotal. You take out those 2 schools out of a village and you're ripping the heart out of it. And that's what the people of Brookborough, they're coming from a community. They're not coming from whether they're Protestant or Catholic. And Hazel and I actually have children and families in our schools from mixed marriages as well, who then know each other through cousins and friends and relatives. So we're not talking about, you know, Hazel's school over here, mine here. There's a linkage that's been there for a long, long time. To go back to what you said about when it first started, there's a teacher was involved in the history project who was telling me she used to give another teacher in St Mary's a lift many years ago, and they shared the journey, and then they started sharing resources. Mary's an ex-teacher, so she'll know what I mean about the resources. They were sharing resources, and you're talking 35, 40 years ago. So it was happening even then.
Thank you. Could I wish you all the best in your journey?
Thank you, Sean.
Because I think there's an important plus there, and you have alluded to it too, is about revitalising our rural communities as well. And without a school, we can't do it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kinahan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Wonderful to listen and hear, and congratulations on where you've got to. Just before you came in a little while ago, we were asking CCMS and NICE on how we get change, because we've got the shared education bill coming through, and I wondered what advice you've got for us at this end, because what we're getting all the way through is it should be done bottom up, and yet here we are about to put something in top down. What would you like to see us doing with a shared education bill that would actually make things happen easier for you, for those who are embarking on the same journey?
Well, off the top of my head, funding. Hazel's whispering to me. It's all about the money, isn't it? Yeah. I would say to you to listen to people like us and the MOI. And, you know, I have to be very frank. We're not the only schools that are doing shared education. We're pioneers in some ways, but there are other schools that are doing great work. The integrated sector, Trevor has done great work over the years. You know, I have a lot of respect for them. You have to listen to the people that are actually doing it, because I had my reservations about whether or not a shared campus, you know, St Mary's Brookborough, I was appointed there, it's my school, I'm very proud of it. You know, leave me alone please, I'm happy with things, you know, give me back the 2 teachers that I had 6 years ago. But things change, and I now think, well, shared campus in Brookborough is the best thing for Brookborough long after I'm gone. You're looking at society and you're looking at the future when these children are our age. But I would honestly say, go and talk to the people. There's shared education all over Fermanagh. The committee were down talking to the people in Fermanagh. It might not suit everywhere. It might not be possible everywhere right now. But who's to say it can't work in the future? But go and talk to those people, including the parents. I think sometimes people come and talk to people like Hazel and I and the teachers. Talk to the parents and talk to, ultimately, the children. Listen to their voice, because some of the children that are coming through our schools, they don't have the hang-ups. They've grown up in different times. They actually, you know, you talk about the Troubles and they're going, what? Yeah. You know, the Troubles is actually my daughter's history curriculum at the minute at secondary school. It's history, but it still has a legacy. So
I think training is also very important for governors, staff, parents. The Fermanagh Trust ran training and partnership building, good relations, respecting difference programmes. And I think that's very important because, as we say, everyone's coming from a different point. And there are some issues that are difficult to deal with in a shared class. So that training is very important.
Good. Thank you.
And don't rush it.
I think it's important too. I think the pressures facing primary schools and post-primary schools, given the funding, you know, and the pressures therein, and with the Department of Education Sustainable Schools policy, I think that really focused the minds of small rural schools, particularly in the Western Board area, where there's a very high percentage of rural schools. I think where you have 2 primary schools, 66 pupils and 53 pupils. Those pressures help focus the mind, and the shared education campus programme was something that they could see, given their history of sharing, was going to be a real lifeline to them. And I think the work that both schools have done have been fundamental to that.
Thank you. That's very useful. Good luck.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lunn.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose, the light of some of the unkind things I've said about the Moy proposal, that you might expect some hostility here, but there isn't any. Because the amount of sharing that you have done, I've met you both before, and the amount of sharing beyond the curricular requirements is really very impressive. And I would think that a lot of your pupils already know each other quite well between the two schools, you know. So I just wanted to ask you just a wee bit of logistics here for a start. I'm ashamed to say I've never been to Brookborough. The sign on the road flashed past the way.
You see the sign.
I would like to go. There's a hint for you. How far away is the next nearest school in each of your sectors?
About 5 miles.
About the same?
Yes.
Where would that be? Yes.
Well, if you don't know the geography, there's Temple, there's Brookborough, there's Lisnaskea, there's 5 Mile Town, which is in a different word, Maguire's Bridge.
All roughly 5 miles.
All within a 5
I've been to all those places. I don't know how I managed to miss Brookborough.
I'll just make a note of that.
just to get the layout of it, you know. You did say, I think it was yourself, Hazel, said that there'd been a full consultation with the parents, as you would expect, and that the integrated model was one of the considerations
yes.
put to them. Did you involve NICE?
Not at that meeting, no, that was a parent meeting during area planning. But one of the things I think you need to remember is that there was an attempt to open an integrated school in 5 Mile Town, which is 5 miles away, and it closed after a couple of years. Some of those children are now with us.
Yeah, but did your parents get to express an opinion about the possibility of one school rather than two?
No, I think the message came across from both of our meetings that each sector wanted to maintain their own culture and identity, and that came through, and yet they wanted to share and work together, but wanted to keep that separate identity.
Just to touch on what Jim Clark from CCMS said, I'm not in the business of promoting a form of education. I'm a principal of a school. What I engaged with, and Hazel did the same, was meetings with our parents separately to say, in a response to area planning, which was looking at the local solution or a parish-based solution. And they were given a range of options and spoken to very honestly. And as Hazel said, there was an integrated school in the Clara Valley. It closed. But the parents have stated they're very happy with Brookborough controlled schools. They're very happy with Paris. What they want is the two schools to carry on, and the sustainability through the shared campus allows for that. And it's about what I think you've all been commenting on today, is about mutual respect and understanding, and being able to say, well, I'm this, and I'm quite proud of it, and you're that, and you're proud of that. And the old adage from the 70s, I'm okay, you're okay. It's about living together, and the two schools existing on a site, sharing and increasing that sharing for the benefit of the children. And I think, Jonathan, you talked about that we're all coming from the same thing. It's about the education and the social benefits of the children, building a united community.
Yeah, will you continue to have two boards of governors?
Well, we have our boards of governors.
I think you said you had a joint committee.
Yeah, there will be a joint board of governors, and there is at the minute. There's a joint committee.
And you obviously continue to have two head principals.
I think there'll be two boards of governors, but there is a joint committee then from each governors. That's the plan, you know.
Okay, well, I wish you well with this. You know, it might seem odd in the light of what I think about the Moy experience, but it does sound different to me. I suppose, and my hope for the Moy, I think it'll take quite an awful long time for it to materialise from talking to the people down there. But
I met John. We met the Moy. The Moy staff and governors. Some of them came down to Enniskillen for a public meeting, and in which we talked to the parents from both schools about the different models and about the Moy, and they spoke about their experience. And I actually must compliment them. I found them inspirational. I really did. And the work that they've done is tremendous. And I have to say, initially when I first saw it on the news, I remember thinking, what? But it's when you listen to it, it's back to what I said to Danny, you have to go to these people and talk to them, because they're living the experience. The people of Moy have obviously voted for that or want that to happen. Yeah. And I found the Moy people inspirational, as I said.
Yeah, well, fair enough. They voted for it by not a very big margin, but that's okay. But I mean, my hope for the Moy, I think the first point the Moy would need to get to is where you actually are at the moment. You know, I think you're miles ahead of them. Yeah. And beyond that, my hope, and it's actually an expectation for both schemes, that you will end up as one school. It's the only logical,
can I have that in writing, Trevor?
It's the only logical outcome for all this, you know. I mean, and you've got that level of sharing and cooperation and mutual respect and understanding and affection. It has to go that way, whether it takes 5 years or 25 years.
Well,
I certainly hope that's what happens. But in the meantime, fair play.
Thank you.
Could I just say, I'm quite new to the shared education aspect of Northern Ireland, really. I was principal of a large Catholic maintained primary school in Dungannon. I think we had Mr McCausland came down on a couple of occasions, and I hope we were one of the inclusive ones he was in rather than one of the... Yeah, and as I say, we adopted to different cultures, different faiths in that school as well. And I also have the experience of working with schools from the controlled sector. And it amazes me the level of work that does go on that is not made public or that nobody's aware of. I was not aware of the level of sharing that happened anywhere till I came to Brickborough. There's another one up in Moneynick and Duneen. I am amazed at the level of sharing that they have done off their own back, just eager to take the people forward. And having worked with the board in both sectors of schools, it amazes me really that there's so much in common and there's very little difference really when you're in either of the schools. There's really not much difference. Children are the same, teaching's the same, aspects the same, parents want the same thing, and the only difference is that I can see is really faith differences in scripture or whatever. And really the only difference that really exists is the sacramental liturgies, because we would have had Protestant children in our school, we would have had children whose mixed marriages too, and there never was any problem. Some of the Protestant children actually came to watch the children making their first communion. You know, they came, and if there was a party, they were at the party too. You know, it was just, I suppose, enlightening to see, and I think we should really focus on what people have in common and not what the difference is, as I say, because sometimes we create difference, and no matter what Christian religion, or I'm sure Muslim or Buddha, whatever, there's two tenets. One is love God and the other is love each person as yourself. And that really has been the ethos of any school I have been in Northern Ireland. You know, treat people as you would like to be treated. Respect yourself, respect God, respect others. And that's what it really boils down to. So we shouldn't really get hung up on the differences. And I think your role maybe is to ensure that people who wish to do this are encouraged. As I say, CCMS asked me to work as an associate for them on this topic, and as I said, I have just been amazed at the example of these people here who take it to the nth degree. We would have had the cred, we would have had shared, we would have gone away together, we would have been in each other's schools, but not to the extent that these people share on a daily, weekly basis, you know, and we would hope that, again, I don't think it can be imposed from above. I think it is something that has to be nurtured and come from, and I mean, we would have also worked in integrated schools too, and there was never any problem. We all got on wonderfully.
Sorry, Chair. In terms of composite classes in your two schools at the moment, this solution doesn't really solve that problem, does it?
Well, it doesn't solve it totally, but the shared campus and what we're doing at the moment allows us to decomposite. I mean, to a certain degree, composite classes work. It's when you get a problem with, say, primary 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, and 6 when they cross the key stages. I worked extensively in schools where they were 1 year group, and you know, even within that you would have differentiation. Composite classes often they raise the standards anyway because the younger children are extended on and challenged. But the model that we have at the minute, we can actually it allows us to decomposite classes, and the shared campus. See, our school is only down the road. You've never been to Brookbridge, ever, so you don't know.
We have to rectify that.
We'll have to rectify it. It's a short walk, but the short walk with children becomes a longer walk, and the organisation's a problem. If we're on a campus, it would be easier to organise things, and we don't have to worry about the inclement weather in the winter and getting younger children on buses and everything. But the shared campus would allow us to decomposite further, and as Hazel said earlier, utilise the expertise of 6 teachers as opposed to 3 and 3.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Ms McLaughlin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I've had the opportunity to discuss this previously with you, and I suppose it's really, and I mean, I've no doubt, and I don't think anybody around this table or any other table would question the level of sharing, and I think even the enhanced sharing that has went on with the 2 schools, but just particularly interested, given that, you know, cooperation, sharing, enhanced level, and the bottom-up approach, the initial process around T-Book, why it was unsuccessful at that point, and you know, maybe more to the point, have there lessons been learnt for going ahead? You know, or is there assurances? I'm interested, given that it has been heralded as a model that you've very articulately produced today, but the first round in terms of the Together Building United Communities, why? Oh, are you referring to the fact that it didn't go through the first expression of interest? Yes. There was a wee bit of confusion in the first expression of interest that went in that the Department of Education officials seemed to read into the proposal that the 2 schools were looking for a 4-classroom school each, rather than 1, you know, 2 separate buildings. So it was for that reason that the department asked for further clarification and asked that the CCMS and the Western Board take forward an outlined business case, and met with both the managing authorities and met with both schools and their chairs, and made it clear that it had to provide value for money, there had to be economies of scale, that it had to be reflect through sharing through 1 building rather than 2. Because of the Sustainable Schools policy, both schools wouldn't qualify for a new 4-classroom school each. So the proposal was revised, and we've made it very clear in the outlined business case that it's 1 building to be shared by both schools, and there are economies of scale and there are a number of benefits for sharing the facilities. So with that, and this isn't to be any stretch of the imagination or criticism of the work that you're doing, but I'm just interested why, you know, I would have thought the department would have identified that from get-go.
It just seemed to be a misinterpretation of the way it was written.
That's why I hesitated when Michelle asked me what this looked like, and I thought, because I'm not sure how people misinterpreted it. I would never be so daft enough to say, let's build 2 new schools. You know, they're not sustainable. But it is 1 building, 1 school that we share. And that's why, as Iris points out, initially it was misunderstood and we didn't get through. But the department have acknowledged that, you know, they recognise that now.
Chair, but that's absolutely pinned down now.
Yes,
absolutely.
In relation to the outline case and the developing business plan.
Yes.
We hope that made it clear.
Well, the very first line is that the proposal is for a shared campus, a single site, a single building for 2 schools. And
it's wrote it as clear as that.
Very, very clear.
You know.
Okay, well, I just wish you...
I know that the Deputy First Minister was very surprised to hear that as well, that there was no room for clarification, you see. When the proposal went through, they took it at face value, and we never got a phone call to say, well, is it 2 schools? But I'm not pointing the finger or placing blame. I don't know who was responsible, but there was a misunderstanding.
But it's absolutely clear now.
Yes. It's absolutely clear.
Very, very clear. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr McCausland.
Yes, thank you. More just observations than questions. First of all, I think it's very interesting project that you're taking forward, a very good initiative, and it's that principle of taking things in an incremental way with what people want, what people can cope with, what will work at this time. What might happen 5 years from now, 25 years from now, goodness knows, but you deal with the thing as it is rather than trying to force it.
Agreed.
The other thing was the practical sharing between the schools. That's very good. I was interested because I've asked this question in other presentations that we've had. I think it's hugely important when schools come together that the cultural differences between different communities, children come together on a basis of equality, respecting other traditions, and then seeing what can be done together. And again, I thought the interesting example there of in one school there's a tradition obviously of Irish dancing, and the other school tradition of Scottish dancing, and when the two come together they can put on a performance together. And we saw that in Belfast between St Patrick's and the Boys Model in regard to musical performances. I'm just interested there in have you any comments to make on the importance of that there needs to be a cultural confidence in children as they come together?
I totally agree with you. It's an absolute. We come in as equal partners, and as I say, it's about mutual respect. And sometimes children go to sporting events, and I mean, for example, my children have played rugby. Hazel's got some children that play Gaelic football. There's music. We've had plays together. I mean, the drama is another example of how you can bring children together. And we had Irish dancing and Scottish dancing, and the dancers were helping each other and learning from each other. We also entered the Fermanagh Feis together, choral verse speaking, and they had to change the rules slightly because they'd never had a partnership coming in. So they had to revise the rules, and thankfully that year we won. But we went in under the Brookborough shared partnership. So there are many aspects of that, and I think it's up for us, the leaders of the school, with the parents and the governors, to make sure that that's planned out, that it's not ad hoc, you know, and that one culture or sport or language is promoted more than another. But that's about being sensible and about being pragmatic and knowing your children and your parents and knowing each other, and having, as I say, a planned approach.
And I can remember the visit to Mrs. Hampstead's school, and they do great scones, I can say that.
And having
I'm
great
not
scones.
there now, Nels. I don't know what they're like.
You tend to find that in primary schools.
Important point.
Mrs. Overend.
Thank you, Chair, and it's been good to hear your stories, and it sounds very good. I just wondered, just to play devil's advocate, when you talked about being able to do shared education projects, you referred to the money problem. But if you turn that on its flip head, then if you have a shared education campus and you have 6 teachers for the amount of children that you have, do you think will there be progression then? Will there be a force? Will you be forced to integrate further to reduce costs further and economies of scale as such?
Well, first of all, we're not integrating.
I know you're not.
To begin with.
I mean, I understand completely what
yeah.
you're doing. I'm just thinking down the line. Do you
Yeah.
think
Well,
will there be a force for you to think about that further?
Right. Well, if
and
I backtrack to what I said to Danny was about education and about training. Hazel talked about training as well, because I've never had a negative comment said to me about the shared campus from the community that I live in within the wider area. I have had people misunderstanding the concept. They're saying, "Oh, you're amalgamating, you're throwing you're all in together. Sure, you're integrated," and the terminology, lay people, and in fact even people within the education sector, there can be a misunderstanding about the terminology they use. So we're not integrating, but the level of sharing will be increased because we're on the same site. But we can't increase it totally, because then it will end up being an integrated school. But we have to manage the level of sharing.
But that's what I'm wondering. Do you think that will come down the line, that you will be forced to look at that? Or if
it happens naturally, I wouldn't like the idea of forcing anything on any parent or teacher or board of governors. I heard members here on the panel, CCMS, saying, and with you, that it's about parental choice. And I think if you force anything, it won't work. People will go against it eventually if that's not what they want. What we are saying is that through time, the natural progression for Brookborough has been to arrive at a shared campus. when we move in, or if we move into the shared campus, no, we'll say when we move into the shared campus, that level can be heightened, and we've planned for that in the Signatory project, where we're extending the shared education from the morning to the whole day. And there will be other activities as well, perhaps after school activities. We already have a range of things like the parent associating meeting. So I would prefer to see it happen naturally, but I don't have a crystal ball. You asked me 15 years ago, would I be talking about shared education? I wouldn't have been, so I don't know where it'll be in the next 15 years.
And I think, just through the chair, I think it's all to do with sustainability. I think what we would be hoping, both from a managing authority point of view and from the school's point of view, the brand new shared campus will be state-of-the-art facilities. We would hope that it'll be attractive to parents to send their children there, and therefore that will ensure the sustainability in the future. We wouldn't be pushed into any cost-cutting exercises.
Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to be devil's advocate. But wish you well. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Could I just make a point on Trevor referred to it, the delay in getting things up and running in Moy, and can I just say that is absolutely no fault of Moy Primary or Moy Control School. It's because of the bureaucracy that they have to go, that there are stages that they have to go through, and there is a project group working on it at the minute, and as I say, it's certainly no fault of the schools or the boards of governors. It's just that it does take time. They received approval in June, and they're now putting in the economic appraisal, isn't it? The full business case. So it's just taking time. It's not that there's any delay. But I do think that there's a time when things are right, and sometimes if things do stall and take time, and sit there, people lose the impetus. The impetus gets lost, and that would be a terrible tragedy if that did happen.
And I think, just to add to that, through the chair, also, there's not just a simple matter of getting a site, building a school to accommodate all the children. There's governance and accountability arrangements to be put in place, and memorandum of understanding between the two managing authorities, and then service level agreement for the use of the facility. So there, as Mary says,
there's a lot of red tape that's preventing them from getting together.
Could I, in your CCMS role, has there a decision been made about, I think it's St Mary's in 5 Mile Town Primary School?
My role is only really shared education. Mine is really just to support the schools that wish to go forward with their plans at this time, and that's really my brief. I'm a grandmother now for 2 days a week, and I do this on a part-time basis, and I really am enjoying it. And as I said, I'm really impressed by the people that I've met and the commitment that they have.
That was just to prove I do go to Fermanagh, and have with Tom Elliott.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. Can I thank you very much for presenting to us this morning? Can I wish you well in your project?
Thank you very much.
And moving forward then to correspondence, members, we have 6 items plus 1 tabled item. A number of these we are already in correspondence with the department around, anyway, particularly around the Civil Service Voluntary Exit Scheme, and also the Sentinus budget. Queen's invitation, it is a plenary day, so if members are content that Peter goes on our behalf. The computer coding in schools, again, if members are content that we follow up again with SIA, just with regards to the level of acceptance of applied A-levels by universities in the rest of the United Kingdom, and also with regards to SIA's review of exam specifications and the implications for qualification portability. So if you're happy to do that, is it on this one?
It's on the letter 5 there, the one about the A-level qualification.
That's what I'm talking about now.
I think, Chair, we need to be very careful about this. It's not so much the recognition that universities give to it. I think it's more. It goes deeper than that. There's actually a very poor recognition of it by employers, who are actually given much higher recognition to equivalent qualifications that obviously come from the technical colleges. Now that in itself tells me there's something fundamentally wrong with the actual makeup of the A-level itself, if that is actually occurring out there. So it goes deeper than just how universities look at it.
Yeah,
it goes to what the employers, the people who are supposed to be qualifying them for, actually look at, and they are finding fundamental problems with the A-level itself.
Okay, well, in addition to that, if we can point that out as a further concern with regards to how that compares with qualifications through FEs. Received an invitation from Nikki, so if members are content that I meet the new Commissioner for Children and Young People. There is a tabled item from Carrickfergus College in relation to the fact that they have additional pupils but actually receiving less money. This isn't the only example of this, so there's clearly a policy issue which we need to explore with the department. I know the number of primary schools have also have similar experiences, so I think that's something that we need to follow up with regards to how this was actually calculated. And obviously the expectation was that they would be receiving more rather than less.
And Chair, thank you for, I mean, I got this letter last night, I think you probably got it as well. But also the Minister did promise to us that there'll be no cuts in the aggregate budget, and I think we should be pushing all the cases that come in front of all of us. I've got about 5. It doesn't look like anyone's actually looked at the numbers that they have this year or had. I've also got one school that is having money taken off it because they were given too much money last year. And I just think there's
I think we probably just need to explore this.
Yeah,
and,
I think we need to get in.
And the various examples that we have, we can pass those to Peter and see if we can get a response from the department.
So, Chair, this is about changes to in-year enrolment and the absence of funding.
Yeah,
that's
yes.
what we're talking about.
Yes.
Very good.
Okay. Any members, anything else on this, please?
It's just to comment on the letter from Jim Stewart about Sentinel's funding.
Oh,
yes.
And this just seems to fly in the face of all the departmental approach to this thing. And it's on the back of one that was mentioned last week, the week before, which is a extra funding for language tuition in primary schools. These are both high priority areas. They're not big amounts, as far as I understand. So why on earth? There's a kind of a broad brush or approach to these various cuts. And obviously, we have to have cuts, but to have to cut quite so deep in terms of departmental, what I understood were priority areas, Could we perhaps write back to the Minister on behalf of Sentinels? He hasn't asked us to, but I think he's just being polite,
We have been in contact with DE and with regards to the cuts for all the third-party organisations, that was including Sentinels, but we can write them again, highlighting the issue for Sentinels.
I wouldn't be making the case for all third-party organisations, but there's 2 jump off the page here, and there's probably more.
But again, we'd raised this even during our debate around STEM as well, so it'd be useful that we go back to them again, highlighting the inconsistency, I suppose, with regards to approach for STEM in schools.
This is an anticipated 25% cut, which presumably they had tried to work towards managing, and now it's become all of a sudden 50%.
There's another motion down for next week then about women in STEM subjects. So that's another opportunity to raise that point. Does their funding for Sentinels end at 31st of March?
Well,
is it, or what
it doesn't end completely. I think they're cutting their core funding by 25%, stopping funding certain other projects, which adds up to a 50% cut.
50% cut. And will that kick in on the 31st of March?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Members content then we deal with the remainder of the correspondence as per the cut sheet. Okay. Also advised the clerk has received resource material from NICE relating to the Delving Deeper Religious Education Programme, and also resource material from the Department for Children with Special Educational Needs in the Irish medium sector. So if anyone wants to have a look at those, they're in the committee office.
Indeed, Chair. The Delving Deeper stuff, it's a box full of stuff, so that's why it's not in your packs.
So you can delve deep into it.
Right, okay.
So we have then moving to our draft forward work programme, pages 183 to 186. At our meeting on March 4th, the committee agreed to meet with concerned parents regarding the designation of St Ronan's in Lurgan. Parents would like to speak to the committee as soon as possible. Thursdays and Fridays unsuitable. Tuesdays and Wednesdays are booked out until after Easter, so it's suggested that members meet with the delegation of parents on Monday. This Monday coming, the 23rd of March at 1 p.m. in room 55. So if you'd like to put that in your diary, so if you're content to do that. And then we've table papers which include members pack for the informal meeting with Glenveigh Special School today at 5 o'clock in room 55, and then for our joint health and education committee event at 6 for 6:30 in the Long Gallery. So obviously encourage as many members as possible to be at that. It'll be useful for our deliberations for the SEN bill. Tabled items which include details of next week's Money Sense event in the Long Gallery on Tuesday at 12:30, and again that's in the Long Gallery.
Sorry, Chair, just on that, so there's quite a lot happening.
Yes.
So we've today, Glenveigh at 5, health event at 6:30, next week, Tuesday lunchtime, Money Sense. Monday quite
St.
right.
Ronan's.
Monday St. Ronan's, Tuesday Money Sense.
And Wednesday we're in Limavady.
But also on Tuesday, Chair, Assembly Broadcasting have asked if they can come along and film that, because it's kids, there's the information's in table items. It's post-primary children from New Lydia Integrated School in Carrickfergus, doing something about learning about money sense.
Well,
So,
we're not sponsoring that event, are we?
we've invited them, yes.
It's Money Sense is it was our initiative, was
Yes, it was the
Okay.
committee invited them, so the Ulster Bank
It
wrote
was
to the
before
committee.
my time.
I think it's been on the books for a long time, yes, for quite a long time. But if the committee are content for Assembly Broadcasting to film, it's Ulster
Money
Bank
Sense
themselves.
themselves.
All right, if they're content for that.
Okay. Yeah.
Just
All right.
my
Go through
diary is
quickly.
not accurate here. 5 o'clock today, Glenveigh.
Glenveigh in
Where's
room
that?
55,
55.
and then in the Long Gallery it's 6 for 6:30.
That's the health event?
That's the health
Around-
education event. Yeah.
And then St. Ronan's on
And St.
Monday.
Ronan's on Monday at 1 p.m. in room 55,
Any more?
and then Money Sense at 12:30 on Tuesday in the Long Gallery.
It's going to be the.
Sorry, what's that?
Sorry, apologies. Mine was when something else. What's Monday again?
St. Ronan's.
Where?
It's in room 55.
Monday at what time?
1.
1, and then
Then we have Money Sense
right Tuesday.
at 12:30 in the Long Gallery on Tuesday.
Okay.
And then finally, next week's meeting, we're in Limavady
Yeah.
High School at 10:30. And we're having lunch then at St Mary's High School in Limavady. Okay, members content to endorse the forward work programme?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other business? Well, members are content.
Is there anything on Friday night at all?
We're keeping that free.
Oh, are we? Oh,
In the meantime, you may receive an email before the day's end. So our next meeting is scheduled to begin at 10:30 next Wednesday, the 18th of March, in Limavady High School. Committee is adjourned.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, members.